Hey, Chris. Let's see. Looks like you're in the session.
Hey,
How's it going?
good.
Awesome. Well, the fact that you're in is a good sign that I haven't completely messed up the technology, so that's encouraging.
Absolutely. Yeah, one second. Let me just go help some kids get out the door, and I'll be right back.
Sure.
Jordan, if you're going to read,
Yeah.
log off and join the.
Okay. Hey guys, hey Chris, hold on 1 second. Somehow I'm landing up with some people in what looks like a different session. I don't know why that is, as I'm using this one link. Oh wait, I think I know what it is. I think it was an embedded link, and the actual link behind it is something else. Shoot. So I just resent it to everyone. Okay. Okay, Andrew's in. Let's see. Let's make sure other folks.
I've seen that happen by a few different people at different cases. I don't know why it's so common, but it happens.
Yeah, I think it's on my end. I know what I did. Hold on, guys. I'm just gonna mute this side to. I see people in the other session. Hold tight.
Cool.
Okay, we should get a couple more people coming into this one. I just saw that they were in the other one. Let me actually look at that email to see if I can. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Darn, I didn't update the embedded link. Okay, it happens. Made a correction. Should be all good. All right, Chris. So warm up your vocal cords, Chris, because we're gonna start soon.
All right. Been doing my voice practice all morning.
I don't know what that looks like, but great. All right, I think I'll just give it 1 or 2 more minutes to make sure people will show up in the right place instead of the old link. Okay.
The first one to join?
Oh, nope. Hold on a second.
I can't hear you anymore.
think he muted himself so he could talk to someone on a different Hangout.
Gotcha. Exactly what I did. All right. I can just do a quick nod. Can everyone hear me? Good. Okay. So let's get started today. So good morning. It is Sunday, February 10th, 2019, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we're joined by one of our mentors, Chris Butler, who's going to be talking to us about user research is a surprise. Let me just briefly explain the format of these sessions and the Product Mentor program in general. The Product Mentor program was started about 5-6 years ago with the goal to pair experienced product people with earlier career product people to help make better product people. Today we're joined by many of the members, both mentors and mentees. So for all those folks that are part of the program this session, give us a little wave, say a quick hello with your hand. And then we're actually going to do introductions by all of the members of the program. Why don't we do that in just 1 minute? Just a reminder, you could post questions to the Q&A section at theproductmentor.com/live. As the questions come in, I will then jump in and pass them to our mentor during the talk. If you do post a question and you're one of the mentors or mentees, I will actually switch the video over to you so you can ask your question directly. If you're not in the program and I see your question come in, I will do my best to get it myself over to the presenter. So let's do some introductions. Let's keep it pretty straightforward and not super long. Just your name, your role, where you physically are in the world. Like, don't say your living room. That's not as interesting as what part of the world you're in, and your company. That being said, so I'm just going to go relatively randomly from left to right, at least on my screen, and start with Alberto. I think we can hear you, Alberto.
Sorry, I think I was on mute. Hey, I'm Alberto. I've been doing product for a really long time. I live in New York City. Latest product is a platform that lets you invest in art, just like you can in stock and other alternative assets lately. So something like being able to invest in real estate, but by buying shares instead of entire buildings.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
I'm Andrew Shu. I've been product manager and
I muted him.
that was strange.
Right, Andrew.
Sorry. Yeah, I've been a product manager for about 7 years, and I'm currently working at Oscar Health, where I'm helping manage all of our provider and doctor information so that we can kind of serve our members in the most effective way.
Great. Chris B.
Yep, so I'm Chris Butler, Director of AI for Philosophy. I've been a product manager for about 18 years now, and I live in New York.
Great. Okay, Dominic.
Hi there, Dominic. in Brighton in the UK, work for a company called Dillstone Systems based in London. I'm a product manager for a product called File Finder, which is a tool used by the executive search industry.
Great. Over to Foothill.
Oh, that's probably me. Is that me? Yes.
It is you. Yeah.
I'm Sharon Allpress. I'm a mentee in the program. I've been a product manager for about 3 or 4 years, officially, the official title. I work for DCP Midstream. It's an oil and gas company. And my product helps us most efficiently route gas from the well to the plant. So some prediction in there.
George.
Hey, I'm George. I'm a product manager at Facebook, and I am a mentee in the program, and I'm currently in San Francisco, so it's bright and early over here.
Great. Greg.
Seems to be a sticky mute button. Hey everybody, my name is Greg Rokowski, currently a product manager at a company called CB Insights. I've been a product manager for about 5 years officially, and I currently work in New York City but do live in Long Island.
Gotcha. Okay. Shobit.
Hi, I'm Shobit, a product manager at Google for Crashlytics, which is our crash reporting for mobile applications. I've been a product manager for 6 years, and I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts, where it's cold.
Understood. Okay, great. I think that's everyone's in the session right now that I could see. Does all good. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk to us again about user research is a surprise. Chris, why don't you take it away?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Great to have everybody here today. I'll be talking about user research is I've last minute changed the name just in the name of surprise, but user research is about surprise. And I have a link here that will be a link to all the slides if you want them, and it will be at the end of the slide deck as well. So yeah, so let's get started. I'm Chris Butler, Director of AI Philosophy in New York. I've been part of the product mentor group for at least since session 4. I skipped 1 and then I've done 6 through 10 sessions recently. My background includes Microsoft, Waze, Horizon, Kayak, and then I even started my own company. And then if you want to either email me or tweet at me, those are my contact information. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about user research. And if the first topic that I think is important to go through is really why do we do user research? Why is it helpful? Then I want to go through what a sample research cycle will be, where we're planning, executing, and then synthesizing that research. I want to talk about research as part of your greater cycle of product management. And then finally, a little bit about the future of research and where I see it going. So why do we do user research? And we always have to start, because I work for a design consultancy, we have to start with Don Norman because we always have to pray at the altar. But he wrote a book, Design of Everyday Things. He's done an awful lot of work actually around kind of human-computer interfaces, design, user research, things like that. And one of the stories that I found while doing some research into kind of different types of human-computer interface and automation is one around calculators. And so calculators are something that I guess the first question I have for everybody is, how many times do you hit the clear button whenever you're using a calculator? And I'm guessing that it's multiple times. And I'm guessing that it's probably multiple times on many different types of calculators. And he saw this when he was doing research in the mid-'80s of how people utilize calculators. And the reason why that happens is because we have this ritual that by jamming the clear button a bunch of times, we know we'll get to some type of state where we will make less mistakes. When the reality is the difference between, say, a 4-function calculator or a scientific calculator or an accounts calculator, they handle memory very differently from each other. And so what this really meant for him was the mental models that we're creating about technology. And what's interesting when we talk about user research is that, and this is a direct quote, so we must discard our hopes of finding neat, elegant mental models. So if you ever talk to anybody that has decided to go off and build something for 6 months without ever talking to an end customer, they believe there is some way that that person understands the world. But the reality is, and they usually do this in a way where they think it is very logical and kind of clear, but the reality is that, you know, we need to learn to understand the messy, sloppy, incomplete, and indistinct structures that people actually have. And so what this really means is that whatever our mental models are not what our user models are, our users' mental models are. And so what we need to be doing is we need to be going out and talking to them to understand what their models are. And that's maybe the first point I would make about user research, is that you may think that you're a user. You know, everybody says the mantra that we're not the user. But we're not only the user, but we also interpret the world very differently than our users actually do. The second thing is I just got back on Friday from a conference in Seattle called Interaction, which is a design and UX conference. And so I did a very brief talk there about randomness and biases. And the core of the talk is that, you know, when we have teams of people, we try to create diverse teams of understanding so that we break down biases that we may have about the world. And then the second component of that is we actually go off, we talk to our users to understand what are the biases that they have and what are the differences in the way that we make assumptions or interpret the world when it comes to risk. And what this really means to me is that the second point, very briefly, is that by doing user research, we're actually reducing the bias and risk of building the wrong thing, right? So not only we're doing that through making great teams, but also by going off and talking to people. The talk actually goes into that there's more you need to do around how to break down your own biases or assumptions about the world. But I think user research is really the second major step towards getting there. The third thing really comes from Jared Spool, who, you know, again, we're talking about user research, we're talking about design. We have to mention Jared Spool, and I've definitely stolen a lot from him over the last couple of years. But one particular article really goes into the reason why teams that talk to customers do a better job of user experience. And what he's really saying here is that whenever you have people going off and talking to them, they do a much better job of building an experience that's actually valuable. And so that's my third reason for really using user research. And then trying not to be too self-referential here, but the fourth one is really around competitive. And so you know, I wrote a post here as part of the Product Management Insider, which is done by Alpha. But really the idea that you can try to figure out who your competitors are by going out and looking at the market. But the only way that you really understand who is competitive in your end user's mind is actually by talking to them. And so that's the fourth point, is that to really learn who your competitors are in the mind of your user or mind of your customer, you have to go off and talk to them. So in recap, really, why do we invest in research? One is our models are not our users' models. We need to go out and figure out what they are and understand them. We need to reduce the risk of building the wrong thing. We won't always remove all risk, right? Because even markets change over time, even after you've released and become successful. And three, you'll have a better user experience overall. And four, you'll actually understand how your customers think about your competitors. So now that we've talked a little bit about why we do user research, let's talk about the user research cycle. And it really breaks down to three things. And this is kind of my clunky way of trying to explain two different things about each of these stages. One, what are the main activities? And then two, what are the questions you should be asking yourself during those stages? So the first stage is really where you're in the planning phase. And this is where, you know, generally you don't just go off and just talk to people. And the reason why that is that you're probably going to be asking the wrong things. You're probably, you know, without preparation, you're going to just go off the top of your head. But what you really want to be doing is making sure that you're aligning everything that you're going to be doing during your research with the actual questions and needs you have as a team. And so the activities here are general planning. And so that's kind of like figuring out who's going to help, figuring out the schedule, things like that. You're going to be writing some type of interview guide, which will be, I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. But really trying to get feedback from the team to make sure you're asking the right questions. You're going to do recruitment, which is you're going to go to wherever your customers are and you're going to find them and get them to say yes to be part of this, to participate in the study. And then finally, you're going to schedule them. During this phase, what's really important is you need to be focusing in what is our main question, right? It's very, very rare that you go into some type of research, even for very early stage discovery work, where you do not have a particular question or hypothesis or need. And so I just want to make sure that's clear. Second thing is there's lots of different ways you can do research. And so this is where you're going to be talking about, what is the right type of research for the question that we have? And then finally, who is the right type of person? Who do we think our customer is right now? During the execution phase, you're really doing these interviews or visits or some type of, sending out surveys, things like that. And during this phase, what's most important to try to understand is how do you actually reduce your own bias from the process? So you'll have ways that you think things should be happening. But if you allow that to kind of interject itself into your research, you'll do worse research. And then finally, how do we reduce the bias of our interviewees? So, they have beliefs about their world, which is not actually reality as well. And so how do we structure our interviews so that we get away from that? In the synthesize phase, this is after you're done actually doing the interviews. You're going to then review the interviews again. Usually you should be recording them. You're going to do something called synthesis, which is trying to break this into parts that you can now use with the rest of the team, and then finally distribute this information, usually to stakeholders and usually the rest of your team. And really the questions here is, what did we learn? And maybe getting to the point of this talk is what is surprising to us and our stakeholders, and why. And that's actually the most important information that we're trying to get out of here. So I want to just talk really briefly about what my stack is for research. So when we do research, we're not doing it alone. We're not doing it usually just with our bare hands. There's actually a lot of tools that we utilize. And so the first set is really, I do a lot of my own recruitment when I do research. And so I do that via Craigslist or LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, that could mean things like doing posts to network to other people, but it could also be ads. I use Calendly to do scheduling because I'd much rather give someone a link and they decide when it will actually fit into my schedule. I found Zoom to be pretty great because I can give people phone numbers, I can give them web links, they can do web sharing, I can see video conferencing of them, but then I can also do recording very easily, and they do a pretty good job of compressing that recording. Finally, I'll use Google Docs and Sheets really for interview scripts and synthesis, and then Sheets for something called rainbow spreadsheets, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But it's really just a way to do synthesis. Airtable I use for nuggets, which is another part of synthesis, and I'll talk about that. And then finally, Temi is something I've found to be pretty great when it comes to transcription for longer term storage. So that's my stack. Definitely recommend you check out these tools. There are definitely at least a handful of tools in each of these categories that I've tried out that maybe haven't fared as well or haven't worked for me as well. So I'm happy to talk about those too if people want to later. And again, the most important aspect of research is it has to start with a directed question. If it doesn't start with a directed question, you're going to be wasting your time because you're just going to be asking very, very generic things that are not getting towards some real information. I always feel amiss to not mention the Cynefin framework in any talk because I think it's very interesting to talk about when we talk about the idea of problem domains. And so I use Cynefin when we think about the type of question we're asking and what is the problem we're trying to get at. And so if you're not familiar with Cynefin, it's actually by Dave Snowden, who is not the Dave Snowden you're all thinking of, but Dave Snowden from IBM Research. And he created this where there's actually 5 domains here, where there's obvious, which is really things that we understand very well, we've done lots of times. There's complicated, where it gets into this idea of experts are really helpful here. It's something, like the difference would be that logging into a web service would be obvious, but maybe setting up something like Salesforce and configuring it would be complicated. Complex is when we get into this domain of how individuals are operating with each other. This is the domain of complex adaptive systems, social networks, things like that. So it's really about like emergent behavior, emergent practice. And finally, chaotic, or not finally chaotic, but the fourth is chaotic, which is where just you have no idea what's going on and you just need to do something. And then the middle domain, which is where that like little red area is actually the disorder domain. And that's probably the most dangerous one to be in when we talk about this framework, because it's one where you don't know what types of constraints or problems you're dealing with. And so what does this have to do with user research? To me, the problem that you're trying to find out more about will slot into one of these 4 major domains. And so I think when we talk about doing research, if it's in the obvious domain, it's something where this idea of best practice is out there. Like people have done it many, many, many different times over and over again. And so the idea of going off and say doing some very open-ended discovery research is not as helpful, right? What you should be doing is you'd be going out there and what are the standards? What are people doing on a regular basis? And you should use that as your research. So it's more like going and doing investigation than talking to people. We talk about complicated. This is where we start to get into the it's a domain where we do want to go off and we want to interview people, but we mostly want to interview experts, because the people that are going to be regular customers may not have an actual knowledge of the way the world works when it comes to doing something. And so this is subject matter experts. This is stakeholders. These are people that really understand the problem very well. In the complex domain, this is where we start to get into where prototyping is really helpful, right? So you don't necessarily know how the system works inherently. You do know that you need to create things, and this is where the probe, sense, and respond comes in the Kinevin framework. But you need to create safe-to-fail probes, which in our case tends to be, some type of prototype that will go off and will now not only observe the way people do things today, but also now have them try to use a prototype that we've actually built. And then finally, chaotic is probably the easiest one to deal with, because you just need to do anything at this point. So that means you probably just start building before you actually go off and talk to people. And then, the discovery work that I think is hardest but most interesting and maybe more rare is really in that middle part where we're disordered. So you actually have no idea how the system works. You need to go off and start to talk to people. This is where it tends to be very open-ended discovery work, usually user research, where we're interviewing people or observing them in their place, which is called contextual. And so I'll talk about that in a second. So now, once we've started, this is basically the overview of how we're thinking about user research. When we get into planning user research, we first need to start with the interview guide is something that I tend to think about a lot. And so in these interview guides, I really break it out into 4 major sections. And so one is really the instructions. I'll include goals sometimes as well, but usually it's the instructions that should almost be read verbatim for the participant. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. We go into background questions, so who they are, what do they do, how long have they done it, what did they do before that. We then go into how they do things today. And ideally, you have them show you this in some way. But it could be, just describing the process as well. And then more often than not, you will have something that you want to show them that you then want to get feedback on. And so that's when you're testing new things. And so what I wanted to do really briefly is I wanted to walk you through a interview guide that I created for a project kind of middle of last year. I've removed a lot of the information that would identify who it was for. But as you can see here, I have a high-level goal. There's some instructions for people about like sending out reminder emails, setting up Zoom, things like that. But you'd be surprised, we always forget things. The interview script really talks about this idea of setting people at ease and really trying to build a rapport with them about the fact that, 1, we're getting consent for recording. 2, we want to make sure that they understand that we're not testing them, right? Like that is probably the biggest issue, is that when you're dealing with people that may be concerned about their job, for example, they may not open up as much. And so trying to set them at ease with the fact that there are no right answers is really important. We talk about background. You can see here some pretty basic questions around their profession. I do like to understand the history. In this case, it was about people that were expecting or had expected a child while working, so we wanted to ask some basics around that. We then move into, think back to the last time you took parental leave. And we had a lot of questions here. This one was actually maybe overkill. I would probably start with fewer questions up front. Then we moved into, we would now ask them to open the link that we had sent them. And from there, we have a couple different tasks that we're trying to get them to do. But what we'll do is we'll prompt them by saying, in this case, let's say you opened an app to help plan your pregnancy. Our goal is actually hidden from them, so they don't know what they need to do at this point. And then we have a bunch of questions about, how are they interpreting these screens? And you can see this, that there's a couple different tasks that are associated. After they're done with these tasks, we would then debrief them. So, you know, how did you feel about what we showed you? If you had 3 wishes, what would you change about any of this? And that 3 wishes is not so much about features, but it's about the problems that they have in the back of their head about this stuff. The ones that I think are also interesting are like, what was there anything that we didn't ask you but we should have? Right? That's a question where, you know, you don't always get interesting things out of that, but it just happens to be one of those questions that I find helps get a little bit more information out of people. And then, do you have any questions for me? And what's interesting there is that generally they'll be asking questions about why is the study happening, things like that. And so you can give them a little bit more information at this point. But that's essentially an interview guide that I've used, and I'm happy to make that available to anybody to check it out. So that's your interview guide. Once you have this interview guide, you need to start to think about who you're going to recruit. And just at a very high level, there's a lot that can go into recruitment. I tend to recruit by posting ads and then pointing them to things like Google Forms with very open-ended questions. When you talk about regular end customers, like there was one time we were trying to get to people that worked in warehouses, and you know, we posted to Craigslist. We offered a $50 compensation. When people would fill out the Google form, we would not ask, do you work in a warehouse? Because there are actually people that are professional user research participants. We had one person named Serge that showed up for 2 different things at some point. So we asked very open-ended questions. In that case, I probably got 100 responses, and about 5 were good fits, and up to 10 would have been analogous fits. So you may need to recruit a lot of people to get to the right people. But of course, you can also use recruitment services. And so that's something we've used on and off if we have a short time frame, but it can be more expensive, right? The compensation is something that is interesting because for regular consumers that you don't really have any needs, maybe other than demographic, it can be pretty low. It can be $25 for, say, 30 minutes. It can get up to $300 or more if you need a very specific type of participant that is a professional of some type. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make it worth their while to actually show up and be engaged. And then finally, when we're talking about emailing all of these people what they need to be doing, and maybe, you know, in some cases, for example, we were doing a study around a virtual reality headset. And so we need to make clear to everybody that they need to be able to operate within virtual reality. They need to be able to stand up, and they need to be able to maybe not, you know, if they had gotten sickness from VR previously, we asked them not to participate. So try to be upfront about those. A lot of the time though, like the requirements are really, we just need you to be on the phone for like 45 minutes. And that's totally fine. So executing user research. In this phase, you know, there's a bunch of different methods that I want to talk about, and I'll go through these right now. So these are the way the sets of I guess research methods that we use an awful lot at Philosophy. So the first one is Sales Safari, and this came from a woman named Amy Hoy, and so she first created this where she wanted to understand what were the problems that a particular community was having in getting something done, basically. And so what this does is the Sales Safari, the terminology comes from the fact that when you invite someone into your office, you are putting them essentially in kind of like a zoo. So you're watching them in a place where they're not usually. And so Sales Safari is more about the idea that you're going to go and observe them in the wild at their watering holes, right? And so in this case, Reddit, things like Stack Overflow, really wherever there's an online community, you don't even have to necessarily interact with people. You just go and look at what the problems are that they're having. And so this is a screenshot of analytics, the analytics subreddit. But like if I wanted to ship something that was really focused on, I'm trying to do a better job of providing analytics services, I would go here and I would see what are all the problems these people are currently having. I would be writing them down. It's a really interesting technique. There's a talk from Lay Web where Amy Hoy really goes into this deeper for about 45 minutes. So I'm happy to provide that. But I think this is a really interesting non-interactive way to go and do research. The next thing is called contextual inquiry. And so contextual inquiry is where we actually go to the site of where a person works and observe them. Generally not really doing a lot, not prompting them a lot, but asking them questions to get clarification, things like that. This was an actual study where we were working with a company that does gas station repair. And so this person was a dispatcher. And so, you know, you can see here in the bottom left, we had like a clipboard and we were writing things actually on note cards as kind of key moments for later. But we were also recording via GoPro so we could review later. But what's really interesting about this is that if I were just talking to this person over the phone, I wouldn't know necessarily that there's all these lists of phone numbers that are behind their desk right there. I wouldn't understand how their desk was set up. You can see that there's another binder over to the right there that is actually a big part of the way that they do their work. So contextual inquiry is one of those things where if you don't know where to start, but you know who your customer is or you know who you want your customer is, contextual inquiry can be really powerful for that. So anyways, the next one is usability and prototype testing. So in this case, you know, we did this via Zoom. We were showing them a Heroku link. And from there, we were actually getting some feedback on a particular prototype. This was actually a built prototype in web technology that was meant to mimic basically an app of some type, a mobile app. But it could be InVision. It could be really anything. Like we could even use sketches to do this. But the whole point of usability and prototype testing is that there's something beneficial about putting something in front of someone rather than just asking them about hypotheticals. And so when you put this in front of them, they're going to have a reaction because they are going to think about like, oh, I might have to use this in the future. How would I use this? And so that idea of prototype testing is really, really powerful. And so I think there's even people in the design world that go under the kind of discursive design, or there was a post last year about provocative prototyping or provotyping. And as much as I hate creating new terms, I think this idea of actually creating a prototype that is potentially very horrible to get feedback from people could be very powerful. And so that's kind of usability and prototype testing. I'll go into kind of the synthesis and how that's maybe different for usability versus just general prototype testing. But you're always kind of doing a little bit of usability. You're always doing a little bit of customer interview while you're doing these things because you're trying to understand how people are thinking about this. Like, do they trust this more than before, right? Do they understand what is going on these different pages or screens? Focus groups. So this is something I always want to bring up, and I really think that they're a bad idea. So I have not found a good time to do a focus group. And the reason why is that you basically, just like brainstorming as a group is a bad idea. And the reason why is that everybody starts to prime or push people towards some type of consensus. But the idea of focus groups is that people that are more dominant will take over the entire focus group. And you know, there are definitely customers we have that prefer focus groups, but I just wanted to say here, because I have a platform for it, do not use focus groups. They're not helpful. You should be talking to people one-on-one as much as possible. The next thing is surveys. And so as you can probably tell, based on the fact I use this very janky you know, clip art, I also think that surveys are bad. And the reason why is that there is possibly some use for surveys when you want to understand some type of quantifiable information, or you want to scale very high your qualitative information. And so I'd say that there are some people that do good surveys, like SenseMaker, which is a Dave Snowden tool, I think does a good job at trying to get at surveys. But the surveys that you're probably going to do through Google Forms or SurveyMonkey are not going to actually get you the information you need. And especially if you're an early stage company, I feel like going off and observing someone or talking directly to them will gain you way more knowledge. And a talk I just always want to reference about this is by Lisa Rechelt. And so at the Mind the Product, she talks a lot about, and she's from Atlassian, which I think is, you know, another great company that focuses a lot on kind of their user research. But a big problem about this type of surveying, but also people will do this with the qualitative information that they get, is that they will try to now turn it into quantitative information. And I think surveys do that the most. They allow you to actually aggregate information in such a way that you're going to get this like false certainty around the survey that you probably shouldn't have had, especially in very early stage circumstances. So anyways, I would just say, unless you are a really, really good person at doing surveys and you've done them a lot and you're an expert, you should not do surveys. That's my opinion. Finally, if we're going to talk about good interviews, right? So there's a lot of different ways people can talk to people, but I think these are really good, kind of the rule of hand that I would say you should start with, right? So one, you should be observing people as much as you can in their own environments. So that's not always possible. And especially if you're bringing people that are analogous, but they're not going to work in the same environment, then you should bring them into your environment, or you should talk to them on the phone. But again, it's like, I would much rather you have a phone conversation than no conversation at all. Don't ask them leading, biased, or yes/no questions. Those are the worst questions to ask. And you do want to ask them open-ended questions. And in particular, you want to ask what they've done in the past, not what they've done in the future. There's still the issue that maybe past performance is not indicative of future performance. But the reality is that people think very differently about their future than they do of their past. And at least when you're talking about the past, you're going to be talking about things they actually did. And then one rule of hand that I have is that if I feel like I can answer a question on my own, it's probably not a good question in the first place. Because what you're really trying to go for is you're trying to change the way you think about this with your research. And so if you can just answer this question, if there's a statistic out there that is well known, that is good, probably don't need to ask that question again. There's other questions that are probably more valuable for you to go after. So some examples. You know, gym, using the canonical case of like, do you go to the gym is one that I use a lot. So like, do you go to the gym? How often do you go to the gym? Do you hate going to the gym? Those are all horrible questions. And the reason why is that, one, do you go to the gym is a yes/no question. How often do you go to the gym is really a future question that, you know, people are not going to consciously lie to you, but they probably have some feeling that, hey, I go to the gym like 3 times a week, right? But if you ask them and they're like, oh, well, the last time I went to the gym was 2 weeks ago. So there's something that usually doesn't jibe when it comes to their future ideal self versus what their actual self is. And then, do you hate going to the gym? That's an incredibly biased question, right? Like, you don't want them to now be thinking about all the ways that they hate it. You want them to think differently, kind of like a very open-ended way about that. So instead, what I would say is you should be asking questions like, tell me about the last time you went to the gym. And ask about, what were the circumstances? Why did you go? What happened there? What did you do afterwards? And then the second one, you know, is a really great one too, is rather than asking like, do you like or dislike, is this bad or good? You should be saying like, how do you feel about the last time that you went to the gym? How did you feel before? How did you feel afterwards? Those are really interesting questions. So yeah. And most importantly, when we're doing interviews, you are not there to look smart. Be quiet, shut up. You're not there to convince them of anything. If you are, you're doing a poor job as an interview. Right? You should be asking questions. You should be building rapport if you need to, and that is, you know, laughing at their jokes potentially. I think there's a lot of different people that are out there that will either be very like stone-faced versus very interactive. I tend to be more interactive, but I feel that gets more kind of comfort from the research participant. And so, but the biggest mistake that people make, especially early stage startups or people that are just getting into user research, is that they have an idea and they want to validate that idea. The problem is that you should not be talking to them about that idea. You should be doing everything you can to nudge them to talk about the space that your idea is in, but you should not be talking about your idea. You should just sit there, listen, and shut up, okay? It's not your job to be smart. So now, once we've done a bunch of these interviews, right, like we've done, you know, in the case of philosophy, we'll do like 3 to 5 per week, maybe 10 in a week if we have 2 people that are doing interviews, but not a lot. We'll do that for about 45 minutes per participant, and we get a bunch of information on this, right? So now what do we need to do when it comes to synthesis? So one of the things we do is we do something called kind of affinitization or grouping. And so we'll take all of the different kind of individual observations that we thought were interesting or meaningful. We'll sit in a room with a whiteboard, and we'll start to group them on different kind of like, this was all about this type of thing, this was all about this type of thing. This was a particular one where we were working with PwC and Google for that field service operations group. And we wanted to look at everything that had to do with the AI part of the system. And we wanted to graph it. In this case, we wanted to get some better understanding about, well, one, did they understand what the machine was doing in that case? And so the vertical axis is not understanding at the bottom to understanding at the top. And then from negative sentiment to positive sentiment from left to right. And what was interesting about this is we saw some interesting groupings, right? So below the horizontal line, it was really, they didn't understand what was going on. So we either need to do a better job of like change management, or we need to just fix the UX because it wasn't doing what they needed it to do. The upper right-hand corner was that the automation in this case, or the AI in this case, the machine learning kind of prototyping was doing what they thought it would do. And it was good, right? So these were, you know, validation of what we called Patrick at the time, which was the bot. And then the upper left-hand corner ended up being, I know what it's doing and I don't like it. And so we first interpreted that as job security. So like, why is this thing taking over? Now, what's interesting is that you can actually look at this in a couple different viewpoints. So those two clusters, the one on the right and the one on the left, you could look at, you know, this is the right stuff to automate and this is job security. But you could also look at it from the standpoint of that things in the right-hand cluster is really the bullshit job stuff. right? And that's the stuff that they don't feel like they should be doing. But the stuff in the upper left-hand corner are the things that really make their job meaningful, right? And so once we interpreted that way, it meant that we were thinking about the next step very differently than we would have otherwise. So there's still an incredible amount of interpretation that comes into this. So the question is like, how are we interpreting this correctly? A second way that we will do interpretation, and this is called a rainbow sheet by Tomer Sharon, who was originally at Google, was head of UX for WeWork, and then now is at Goldman Sachs. But he created something called a rainbow sheet. And this is another way to kind of do analysis where you create a spreadsheet where you have a list of tasks that you want, that you believe that this person should be able to complete. And then for each of the participants, you basically mark in, and we had special spreadsheets that were set up that if you typed anything in one of those boxes, it would turn that color. But you can start to see which of these processes actually worked, which of these processes did not work so well. And this is really helpful when we're talking about analysis of usability tests. So, the things that are lower on there, like didn't notice the message bar, is something where it did not test very well. So we should consider that we change the way we're dealing with that particular thing. Next thing that we use when we're doing synthesis is this is Temi, which is, you'll upload. This is the example where we had actually like a VR user test. We ended up having to splice basically the video of the VR that they were seeing, a video from a GoPro of the person themselves, and then also a Zoom because there was like a web prototype that was involved. So it was a very complicated system to pull together all this video. But then we would upload it to Temi, and then Temi would essentially do transcription. And it does a pretty good job. You can pull clips out very easily. I figured out a way to like link directly to particular clips from different things. But I found this to be really helpful. And the reason why is that sometimes it's easier to parse the text than it is to watch the video, and sometimes vice versa. So I found this to be very helpful when we talk about just like how you deal with recordings and how you deal with the transcription of things. I found this to be helpful. Temi is, I think, 10 cents a minute. You can get up into, very, very expensive if you use manual services, but I found Temi to be pretty effective. It doesn't do a good job with like highly specific industry jargon, but that's something you just need to keep in mind. So then what we do usually, once we go from Temi, we have a transcription, we do something that's called nuggetization. And this is, Tomer Sharon is someone that I have a lot of admiration for because he's created a lot of very interesting methodologies. And so one of them is this idea that there's some atomic unit of research that is helpful. And that atomic research should be stored somewhere so that people can use it in the future, right? And so essentially, when we talk about these Temi transcriptions, it's not necessarily every single sentence here is interesting, right? Or every single sentence here isn't helpful. So what we want to do is we want to pull out some of these nuggets, and that's something that we use Airtable for, right? So we talk about pulling out nuggets. It really is usually a quote. It could be an observation as well. We do this manually today. I want to talk about the future in a little bit, but there's this idea that once we go through the transcripts, we pull out nuggets. And I would say like for, say, a 45-minute interview, there could be about 45 nuggets, right? There could even be more if they're talking very fast. And so we then have a link directly into the Temi so that they can look at the video if people want. But we also start to tag it. And this allows us to now do some interesting things, right? So in this case, the persona for Paula was the expectant worker. So I could go into this system and I could say, all right, we did, in this case, we did 33 hours worth of interviewing over 8 weeks that included 4 personas. But in this case, I just want to understand, when does the expectant worker actually talk about things like 401ks? Right? And so I can go in here and I can use basically a search block as part of Airtable to now say, give me all the nuggets that were related to that. And I think that's really powerful. And so this is something that we've used as kind of a handoff to people, clients especially. But I think this is like a good long-term thing as well for companies to start to create. And what Tomer Sharon was starting to do while he's at WeWork was really create a system called Polaris, which is a way to build playlists of these things. So if you wanted to learn about, say you were doing some work around coffee within the WeWorks, for example, you could go and search for all the different coffee nuggets that were there. You could find the ones that were interesting and maybe actually antithesis to what you were believing to do. And you could create a playlist that now you could attach to work that you were doing and say, hey, if you want to know everything about coffee that I think is interesting for WeWork, because we're going to be doing this work, go watch this playlist. And so, you know, this is kind of our jury-rigged version of it because they've never released Polaris externally. But when I did talk to Tomer about it, you know, he said that there were some teams that really got great benefit out of it. They really leveraged the ability to create these databases a lot. So I can't say enough good things about doing this type of thing. And one last thing I would just mention is that I've been playing around a little bit with this idea of using off-the-shelf services to do automated nuggetization. And so we're still not there yet. But, you know, when we talk about the cost of transcription, when it was like something like those 33 hours worth of interviews, that was like $600 worth of transcriptions costs. When I use my kind of jury-rigged AWS transcribe version of that, it costs about $10. So there's a big difference. It's not a pretty interface, and it's all through this jury-rigged like Jupyter notebook. But something to keep in mind that there are other ways to do transcription that are even lower cost if you need to. And then finally, you know, when we talk about synthesis, you have to do this presentation, usually to stakeholders. And so the format that I found to be really helpful is broken down to a couple different sections. So one is really just great quotes, right? Like, what are the quotes that we think are really valuable that came out of this particular study? You'd store all of this in as nuggets in your Airtable or something like that. But like, what are the really interesting quotes that came out from this study? Next, what did we learn that was new, right? So these things are all building on top of each other, right? And I want to talk about that more in depth a little bit later, but you know, basically, what do we know about the personas and the way that they are that we didn't know before? What do we learn about the current process that they use that we didn't know before? And then what do we learn about our prototype, both from a you know, test kind of tactical standpoint, but also from a usability or functionality standpoint. And then it's very hard to break this apart, but I think it's something that's very important, is that we don't want people to conflate what they think we should do with what we observed. And so I tend to break another section out for what do we believe so that people don't put it within that other stuff. And so let me show you really briefly what that looks like. So again, I've scrubbed a lot of the information out of here, but this one was about for a basically a scheduling tool for a particular industry around availability and status and we built a prototype. So, you know, there are a couple of different great quotes that I thought were interesting. In this case, there were booking agents, timelines, and routes. And so what things did we learn about the way they actually think about stuff today? What do we learn about our prototype, right? And then operations for prototype is really like, you know, we had 2 prototypes and they got confused by that, or there was some weird slowness emailing links. We just need, so these are like tactical operational things for doing the test that we should just do next time. And then, you know, this is my version of kind of a rainbow sheet where I'm looking at different goals we had and then who was able to do it. What didn't copy over here is I would actually put comments for some of these where, yes, they did achieve it, but it was on shaky ground, and where they achieved it, where I think we maybe gave away something or something like that. And then finally, you know, this section where we, you know, what were ideas or solutions that we should consider. So that's the overview of this kind of synthesis document. People will also put it in slide decks. I found that like reading a document with people feels pretty good though. So now that you've finished this research, you've provided to people, I want to talk about how does research actually fit into your process overall as a product person. And of course, I always like mentioning John Boyd's OODA loop, which is really build, measure, learn, or agile, or any of these things, all kind of come from this predecessor, which is observe, orient, decide, act, which was a term from John Boyd, who was an Air Force person that then worked with the Marines to help with their doctrine in the 80s. But what's most interesting here is that as part of your process, right, if you talk about build, measure, learn, this idea of observing and orienting is really what research is all about. And observing is you're going off, you're planning, executing, and synthesizing your research. That's observing, right? You're now, when you're trying to now feed this into what you do as a product team, it should still be a slightly separate step, right? So if anything, the orient step is very interesting because what you're trying to do is now, based on what you've just learned, how do you understand the information that you have? And the reason why that's really important, especially when we talk about this idea of acting, deciding and acting again tend to be kind of conflated in the same thing. But what's really important there is this idea that you need to be understanding not only your business needs, not only your customer needs, but also as an organization, what do you believe is the right thing to do? And so anyways, that's something that I think is interesting. And so if we were to get started on this, right, what's really important is that you start small and simple and then iterate and start to build up. And so what that means is that people feel like they need to create all of this infrastructure right away. I would say that you don't need to do that up front. You should just go out. You should write down, maybe put together an interview guide, maybe recruit some people that are already using your product and talk to them for 30 to 45 minutes. And try to do it as unbiased as possible. I still find myself asking biased questions in the middle of an interview. And so we would start to like jeer at each other if we're on the phone, if I do that actually. But it's something that you learn over time, and it gets easier and easier to do, but it's not something that you're ever going to be perfect at, right? And so, this maybe gets us to another quote from that article by Jared Spool, which is that what is really valuable, and one of the things that he's observed in a lot of teams is that everybody that is making product decisions really needs to be talking to end customers. And so that means even executives, that if executives are doing things that are making decisions about product, they need to be involved with the process. And the kind of sweet spot that Jared Spool has found for everybody on the team, and this includes engineers, designers, product people, executives, is really 2 hours every 6 weeks. And he's found that if you're able to break that threshold, if you're able to get people to go out and like talk to people and watch these like interviews, things like that, that your products will be way more, the experience will be way better for people, and you'll build better things too. And then finally, what we talk about, what is, that line between the observe and orient step and decide and act, is that you should really never take any of your research and jam it into your backlog. This is definitely an anti-pattern I've seen from people. And I think this is one of those things where, I see certain products or services that help product managers that really essentially take user feedback and then just pull it directly over to turn it into some type of ticket that you can work on. And I think this is a big mistake. And the reason why is that you as a product person need to be between your research and your backlog, because you are actually doing the interpretation of what is right or what is wrong. So I just want to make sure that's very clear. It's something that I think is really, really a bad anti-pattern. So for the future, Thomas Rohn wrote this great post about, and I talked to him about this as well, but like, how would your process decisions be different if user research was just like electricity, right? If you could just plug into the wall and get something like that. And I think this is something, I don't know if Nis is on right now, but the idea of alpha and the way that you're asking questions and getting information back is really the beginning of this type of system, right? We want to be able to ask questions. We want to know whether, one, we should go off and collect more information, or whether our current information is out of date, but we should also just be able to get answers from the information that we already collect. And this is a great talk by Claire Gulnick, who is the head of data science at NS1 now. And her talk is all about this idea that evidence is surprise, that for us to actually learn anything, we need to be surprised in some way. And this gets back to that feedback, good feedback needs to be hurtful in some way. We live in this kind of like cocoon of a world that is sometimes an echo chamber, but for us to learn anything, it needs to be surprising. And so this is maybe where I've started to think about the future of how we start to, create research, is that, one, we need to understand the baseline from the client knowledge, right? And then two, we go off and do user interviews to learn new knowledge. And what's interesting to me is that between these three different kind of sets now, you have surprise on the far right-hand side, which is like the most interesting stuff you should be reporting about. You have the middle part, which is known. But then the left-hand side is something I'm still trying to figure out how we utilize correctly. And so that is that we didn't ask the questions to test this information. It could be that there's industry knowledge that is incorrect in some way, or it could be that there's bad assumptions that we have about the end customer. So not only is it about surprise, but it's about what is not jiving with what these people are actually talking about inside their company. And so with that, I will leave you with that thought and just say thank you. But that's where you can find these slides, and I'll send them out to the product group Slack as well. So thank you. That's a lot of information to take in, I guess. But yeah.
Great, thank you,
yeah.
Chris. That was fantastic. Appreciate your time and wisdom as always. And on your discussion around user research is a surprise.
Yep.
As always, this presentation will be posted to the SlideShare channel. And again, a huge thank you from me to Chris. Amazing discussion. I think a lot of takeaways that I think all the people listening in can take advantage of. And looks like, let me see. Oh, there is actually, I see one question from Andrew, so I'm going to turn it over to him quickly.
Great.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, so given, you know, I think as a product manager, we always have a lot of work streams going. Do you have a way that you're automating that rule of thumb to get user research in every 6 weeks, both for yourself and for your team?
Yeah, I think so one of the ways is that I tend to try to avoid dual track development where you have UX or design off at a separate offset. So part of when we're shipping something, we're actually doing user research about it at the same time. And so, I mean, I think that's like, it can be very hard to get into that path, but that's the way that we found to make sure that we do that. But that means that we're actually doing user research like every week or every 2 weeks, right? So we're building something, we're maybe prototyping it from a design perspective in a non-coded way. We're setting up the research, and that's maybe kind of the 1 week while engineering is spiking all of the stuff that they need to figure out to build that particular thing. So they're preparing, they're building baseline stuff. And then the next week, we actually are synthesizing and providing the results to the entire team. The team is then adjusting based on that. So it's more like, it's like a sprint and a jog, I think is, I can't remember who said that originally, but I think that was actually Thomas Sharon. But like a sprint and a jog, like 2 week kind of cycle, I found to be helpful. But we have very small teams. We tend to work on very fast projects. I do think that it's valuable that working, if you have a specific team that does user experience, it's just having people cycle through them that like, they are probably doing research all the time. And so if you have that team, make it a point that everybody has to put in their time, like once every 6 weeks, they spend a day with the team, right? Like this is very similar to the way that people will spend a day once a month as a customer support agent, right? And so I think the same goes for this user experience. You can get a lot around like sales ride-alongs, customer support ride-alongs or working, but I think like actually doing this with your user experience team is helpful too.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think we also have a question from Alberto.
Great.
Alberto, can you also go to your video? Thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hey, so this is really interesting stuff, but I guess like, you know, having worked at a variety of startups where time is super limited, like nobody's gonna have a UX team. What is the best way to try to put this into some level of effort? Like, you know, I've built a lot of different products where we try to figure out if people are gonna be interested and there's not always like a mold or a common industry. What are your recommendations on trying to at least conceptually put this into place when the product doesn't exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, so there's this technique called assumption mapping where, or just like anything where you're trying to get at your assumptions about the world, right? Trying to identify the riskiest assumptions usually drives us to go off and ask people about those assumptions. And so that's what I would say is like, you know, when you're very, very early stage, like if you're doing something like thematic road mapping, you actually don't even have problems on your thematic roadmap at that point, right? Like you don't know what the problems are. But what you do have is you have assumptions or you have hypotheses, or you even just like, you know, if you're at the very beginning of a project, you're in that like chaotic domain that I was talking about from a Cynefin standpoint. And so the truth is that you should just go off and you should have ideally a question because you've been pulled together as a team to do something. So now go off and just talk to people. And I would say like starting with 3 to 5 people, scheduling it that small like of a group, maybe even just saying you'll do it once for now and try to do it like once a month you do that, I think is a great start, right? It doesn't have to be super in depth. I mean, again, I tend to run a lot of this stuff just by myself as a product person. So while in parallel, I'm doing all of my other product activities like road mapping and managing backlogs and like, you know, fielding questions from design and engineering, I'm the one person doing research where I'm doing scheduling, I'm doing recording of these sessions, right? So the ideal is that you maybe have 3 people involved. You have the person who's interviewing, a note taker, and then an observer. But if you have recordings, I just get into the mode of the interviewer. I don't think about note taking or anything else. I record it. I go back through it later. And so again, start very small. It doesn't have to be a lot of people. It only needs to be 30 to 45 minutes per person. But going after what your assumptions are, your hypotheses are, is the great place to start when you're really early stage, right? Later on, you're now looking at like, how do they deal with this problem in a very real way that you know you want to solve or is like part of your strategy as a company to solve. Does that help?
That helps. Thanks.
You're muted.
I think that's all the questions we have for you today, Chris. So thank you for fielding those 2 questions. And again, big thank you for your wisdom and time. Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.
So now on to our next speaker. Again, it's Sunday, February 10th, 2019, just as a reminder. And this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we are joined by one of our mentors, Scott Stokue, and he is going to lead a talk today on build versus buy, evaluating technology decisions. So I'm now going to turn it over to Scott to lead us on that discussion.
Thanks, Jordan. Hey, Scott Stokue here. Great to speak with you all this morning. Coming to you from a remote location of Minneapolis, Minnesota. So if you are happen to be in the Midwest, it is snowing like none other here. So I just flew in from New York yesterday, and here in balmy -10 degrees Minneapolis, it is well, it was -10 yesterday, and today it's just snow. So lots of fun here. Let me pulling up the presentation for you here. So today we're going to talk about, as Jordan said, build versus buy. Really thinking about how we make those decisions on what we should be building, and how to kind of frame up the conversation. This is something I've worked on, most of my career of, hey, we need to get something out. How do we do it? And we're going to go through all those things today. So first, a little bit about me, just so you have some context of where I'm coming from. I like to say a recovering developer. For all of you folks that have a development background and also a product, I'm sure this will be similar to you. I love to go to my developers and say, hey, if we can't do this, maybe I'll just code it, right? I coded about 10 years ago, started in my career as a developer. So understand the technology, but really rely on my technical partners, frankly, because they're into it now. As I've worked in my career, I've worked in all sorts of different companies, from startups being the first employee to being, hey, with your friends, trying to figure out what kind, should we even be in this business, to Fortune 500 guys. If you look at my LinkedIn, you'll see I was at Sears for a bit. Loved it. The e-commerce business there was great. Still is probably pretty good. Although the rest of the business, isn't as good. Spent a ton of time in B2B, and currently I'm over at First Advantage, working in background check software. So I manage our financial services and tech, transportation verticals from a product management standpoint. And along the way, I went and got an MBA at the University of Chicago. So that's a little bit about me. So back to what we're talking about, right? We're going to really talk about today the build versus buy discussion, right? On, do you build it yourself, or do you buy it from someone else? I know in a lot of my career, we've often, my organizations have often said, hey, we should be just building this internally, right? We've got a shop, we've got a dev team, we're build it ourselves here. So in my take is, I need to get something done and something right for the customer. And I'm, while I love to build it here, I'm kind of agnostic about that. So we're going to talk about both of those things here. So we're going to jump right in here. So talk about, thinking about, how do you decide to build your product, right? So how do you decide to build it internally, right? So you've got your idea, and you're saying, hey, I've got this project, I'm going to go build it. So say I'm going to go put in a major piece of functionality. So say I'm going to go put in that new search engine that I need to do. Okay, great. So how do you decide to build? Well, hey, I've got no time constraints on the product. My dev team is completely open. That's never going to happen. Right? I worked with a team fairly recently that we were getting projects in right and left, and they were able to complete them so quickly. The backlog was flowing through. Pretty quickly they were assigned to somewhere else, right? Because resources like that are scarce. So no time constraints is never going to happen. We all know that. But as you think about deciding, right, maybe your tech is a strategic differentiator, right? Maybe how you build something is strategic, right? So maybe having that tech involved is strategic, right? That you don't want your competitors to either know or to use what you're doing. So that's interesting. And adding on to that, it's a core to your offering, right? It's a differentiator, and it's also it is you, right? Could you imagine, Facebook outsourcing their feed technology, right? It's not something they're going to do. It is core to their offering, right? And then sometimes, and this is something we'll talk about in a little bit. We talk about maybe the tech hasn't been built before, right? Or there's no vendors available, right? As I started my career 20 years ago, and I'll date myself a little bit on the web screen. You see a couple of gray hairs on my chin. This happened, right? I would argue now that most of the tech we need is out there, right? But maybe, as you think about it, maybe the tech is deployed in such a way that you can't do it. I work in background screening. We are hypersensitive about keeping our clients' data safe, and sometimes contractually obligated to keep data inside our firewall, right? So using outsourced technologies, a lot of the cool tech that we want to use lives outside the firewall, right? Is in AWS, is in Azure, is somewhere, right? So we have to, either figure out a way to pull it in or build it ourselves, because frankly, we can't use some of these external technologies because a lot of them are delivered via the cloud. Talking about deciding to build, goes back to the first piece, right? And so there's no time constraints, and you have an available tech team. I challenge, folks on this call that have any any availability on their tech teams, right? I mean, if you're running a good organization, and I talk to a lot of product folks, I think the best product orgs are the ones that you've got a backlog 10 miles long, and you're fighting for resources because you've got so many great ideas you're trying to push them through. So switching gears a little bit, right? So we talked about building. Let's talk about buying. Now, as we go through this, some of the key thinking, deciding to buy, I'm going to go back to this analogy of the search engine, right? So if you're going out and getting tech, maybe it's a commodity, right? It's a search engine. I'm working recently in a project where we need to do some facial recognition piece from pictures, right? Now we can go, we could go out and get that tech, or attempt to build it, right? But it is a kind of a commodity now. Azure has some, AWS has it. Like you can buy this off the shelf. If I need something that goes and looks at a picture and can tell me different specs on it, right? We can go out and buy that. Other thinking about buying, right? Does it provide differentiation, right? Do all your competitors have the same thing, right? If your tech isn't a differentiator, go out and buy it, right? Don't spend your limited resources on the tech. And also thinking core competency, going back to search engine, right? And this was a big project of mine earlier in a career when I went and learned a lot about search engines. We needed, every good B2B application needs a search engine. We were doing a project in where the company was built in the sales enablement space, right? We were building pieces around giving the right content to the salespeople at the right times. So search is core to that, right? We needed to serve up content at the right times. We needed to be able to categorize it. We needed to, tag it, and based on those tags, be able to pull it. All of our competitors had great search engines, right? But we didn't want us to become a search company, right? We didn't want to go be one of the big search giants. There was people doing it. We wanted to be core to the experience and core to getting all of the pieces right for our sellers, not in this, in the search component. And search, is something I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, because it's a piece of every kind of application. Here's one of my favorites on buy, and we can hopefully have a discussion a little bit about this. There, we talk about time constraints, right? One of the things about buying is you think, hey, I have time constraints on the product. I'm going to buy something and plug it in, right? Now, we'll talk more about this, but this is a way, I think about it, buying as a way of kind of shortcutting that, right? You can pull this in. There are some gotchas here. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But if you have time constraints, right, and it's not providing differentiation, and you need to get something out, or just get an MVP out, get something into market, buying it or renting it or getting some software that someone else has built is a good option. And then here's the other piece too that I run into a ton, and I'm sure you have as well. Lack of expertise in the house, right? So as you think about the build versus buy decision, do you want to go hire a bunch of folks, especially in this market, right? Or even in any market, you're hiring developers. Over the last 20 years, I don't care the market, we still haven't been able to find developers. You want to go create this, search engine. You want to go create facial recognition. You even want to go create, maybe port your stuff to mobile. Do you want to go get all of those resources and pull them in-house, right? Do you want to go recruit them? Do you want to go learn all of the deep, dark details of this? Of your project? So think about that, of your expertise, and really use that as a factor, right, as you're considering the build versus buy decision. So, we've talked about kind of the key questions asked. Let's go through some benefits and on both the build versus buy. We kind of talked a little. We'll talk more in depth in this slide about those things. As I think about, benefits on building, right? The piece I'm really excited about is I get to control my own destiny. I don't know about you guys, but I know I love to be able to be in touch with my team and say, hey, where are we at this thing? Where is this project going? How is it being done? You can monitor the progress. You can do, as Chris was talking about just in the last piece, you can do the research and then be pivoting as you go. You can get exactly what you need. And that's the next point, really controlling all the features and timing, right? You control what you need. You control everything. It is custom to you. That's great. It is exactly how you want it, right? And if your process is super custom, it's super easy for you to solve that, right? Because you're building it. I mean, easy relative term, right? But you control your destiny here, right? You control when things get out. You control how many resources you put on it. You control all of this. And also you get to sleep at night saying, hey, I know where this project is going as you go through. And maybe there's a competitive advantage, right? Maybe this piece of tech that you're building is so new or so unique to what the market that you're serving that you want to be able to build in-house, right? There is a competitive reason you're going to go out and get a patent for this thing, and you're going to block everyone else from doing it. Absolutely, this happens, right? You're going to create a new innovation that no one else has, right? But be wary as you think about that, right? Be wary that you're really solving for that piece, and we'll talk more in a second on that. Talking about now, I put them side by side so you see the benefits side by side. you know, and I talk now about, instead of buying, you know, even talk about buying and partnering, right? Because buying, you may not be buying. You're somehow getting the software. You're acquiring. I'm assuming a software or a service, right? You're acquiring this piece, you know, immediately. The hope in the build versus buy, right, is if you buy, you're now getting this product immediately, right? You sign a PO, unless you're in a big org, which I've worked in a few, right? And I'm sure a lot of you have, right? Unless you work in a big org where your procurement cycle is, I don't know, is months and years, which, you know, I'll be honest with you, some of them have, some of the pieces I have. But, you know, to be honest, you go and make this decision, you pitch it, you get it done, you decide to do it. After you sign that PO, they send you a license key, or they send you a password, or they let you try it, right? Or you can get this piece immediately. Because we're thinking about, you know, all the great services from AWS and Azure and Google. Like, you can go and trial any of this, right, with the usernames you have. So you can go and get this immediately, right? And you can be playing with it tomorrow. The other thing I love about the buying piece is I don't have to do maintenance on the core feature, right? So as you think about building something new, right, and this is something we gloss over as dev managers and product managers, is everything we build, right, we have to maintain, right? We have to put new features on there. We have to make sure all of the software upgrades are in there. It's security hardened. You know, how many of you are dealing with, you know, the times when you have to upgrade all the server pieces, right? So the thing I like about the buy is that maintenance and updates are done for you. And you know, hopefully done without intervention, right? So if you're buying it as a service, right, as a web service, right, on AWS, it is done without intervention. But at least you are, and I work in other pieces where at least I get somebody to manage all of the updates, right? They manage all the interoperabilities and pieces like that. So I love this maintenance piece because I can just go and call my vendor and say, hey, send me a new license key and download, even if it's just downloadable. And thinking last about the benefits on this is, you know, hopefully there's some reduced costs in this, right? So hopefully if you've made the buy decision, you're reducing your costs, right? Your ability to use your resources in other places. All of us are dealing with finite resources. How do we, you know, be able to allocate those resources in other places? So we think about now potential issues, right? So, hey, it's all rosy. We should build or buy, right? It's great. Everything's easy. You know, here's some things to think about, right? You know, again, digging deep in this. You know, we talked about just a minute ago about in the build side, you know, one of the benefits or in the buy side, one of the benefits for buying is you don't have to deal with maintenance and updates. Well, in the build you have to, right? We talked about that just a second ago. We have to schedule time in for that. And if we don't, it's one of those oops moments, right? And probably insert your stronger language there. It's one of your oops moments of, oh wow, I've got this thing and now it's not security compliant, or now I need to upgrade, you know, the OS on the boxes it runs on or whatever. Or now I need to secure it, right? So, you know, as I think about in my org, right, I everything I put in as a background check company has to be secured, right? So every new initiative and every box I put in, somebody's got to maintain. That requires a different both dev and operations cost for me. And then as we're doing this, you know, I've put in also software too, where, hey, it's a new core competency or it's a new competency. Now, if I put it in the house, I've got to get staff that understands it, right? And I need enough staff that can maintain it. So if it's a small piece, now I've made it part of somebody's job. And oops, hey, if they happen to go somewhere else, they may take that knowledge with them, right? So they've built up this expertise in this very specialized thing that I just put in. Oh, and they just moved on. Cool, now I have to start over. Or, as I'm sure we've seen in a lot of places, they leave and the product's been sitting there for 3 years, right? We built it. and nobody remembers how to do it, right? That happens all the time. I run into those issues all the time, especially in bigger orgs, right? And we talked about time to market, right? It doesn't get easier, right? We've got competing resources. We've talked about that a ton. But I wanted to make sure that we talk about, you know, and build the time to market is important. That's why I keep putting on there, right? It's about making sure you understand the time, you know, especially if it's something new, especially if it's something your team is either learning or you got to pull in more resources for. You know, and then buying software has its pitfalls as well, right? You know, the product may not have all the features you need, right? So going back to the search engine, right? You know, maybe one of the projects I worked on was multilingual support. We had a huge double byte contingencies in Japanese and Korean. But the software we were using wasn't quite optimized for that. So we spent a ton of time optimizing this piece in kind of retrofitting it for additional languages, especially our more complex languages. So, you know, as you think about the buying decision, you know, it may not be everything you needed to do because your business process may be more specialized, right? You know, one of the things I want to highlight too is I feel like I say, hey, you should just always go out and buy things. And I'll say, to be honest, one of my biases is I make sure to always investigate this, especially as I work with dev teams, because I feel like we want to make sure we have all the right information out there, right? I feel like we want to at least have the discussion out there. So as we think about buying, you got to integrate the thing, right? You've got to integrate the product or the service, and that takes time. You may not have the hooks to integrate to it. I've worked in several shops. We have really old tech. We want to put in buy some new tech. Great. The problem is we don't have a web service layer, or we have a marginal web service layer in our old tech. Oh, well, the new tech needs a web service layer. So we're going to have to go build some stuff. Maybe not a showstopper, but things you need to consider, right? You need to consider the integration costs. They may be good or they may be high, right? And one of the things, you know, as I look at too is, especially you think about new emerging tech, if you're looking at AWS and you're looking at Google and Azure, you know, business viability, you're pretty sure the company's going to stay in business, right? Where you look at there is that feature going to stay around? Is that a beta feature that Google just threw out and you're going to put your whole business on it, right? And Google next week is going to decide to deprecate it, right? And then you're like, oh, I've got to go figure out something else, right? In another case, you might be working with startups, right, who have this cool tech. I'm working with a few now in the spaces we work in. And one of the things we really talk about is how viable is the partner, right? How long have they been around? Who are they backed by? What kind of leadership do they have? Same questions you would ask if you were investing in them. Ask if you're partnering with them, especially if it's core to your business, right? Make sure that they're going to be around, and also have a plan that in case they go out, right? Have a plan to get their tech, right? Right into a contract that they have to put in an escrow, or if it's a service, or, you know, give you the tech. Make sure that there is some exit ramp on that. And also thinking about potential issues, right? Are your competitors using the same thing, right? It's good to know. It's going back to the search engine question, right? Is it providing differentiation, or is it just a Me Too feature? Do you need the Me Too feature because you got other features somewhere else that are great? Well, you've already done that. That's a different product management talk. You've done that analysis. So go and do that analysis and make sure you know where this fits in your competitive piece, right? And understand what your competitors are doing. If you're buying from a vendor, they probably will tell you who their other customers are if you just ask. Sometimes they can't, and that's fine, right? But just ask. You'll be surprised how often they will just tell you. All right, so we've talked about lots of stuff, right? The good, the bad, the kind of gray areas. How do we decide any of this, right? Well, first, let's go back to Product Management 101, right? Let's be clear on the problem we're solving, right? Do we understand it? Do we know the scope? Do we know what it is we're trying to solve? So going back to search engine, right? Hey, put in a search engine. Well, that's cool. But what does that mean? What does a search engine mean to you, right? Does it mean that you need to also search in Asian language characters? Ah, good to know, right? How do you search in those, right? Good to know, right? So have a full scope of what you're trying to do, or as full as you can. Have that picture, right? Also, as you're thinking about this, do you have the steps in mind? Do you know what your MVP is? Do you know what your next steps afterwards, after you've done your MVP? Do you have your vision aligned, right? You know, we talk about this all the time, product management. There's a ton of talks on this, but be clear, right? I can't, you know, as we talk about it everywhere, be clear in what you're trying to build and understand the problem. The next piece is, as we go through this, right? Make sure to do your diligence, right? Make sure to understand the importance of the project and where it fits in your business, right? So building on from having a clear understanding of your project, do your diligence, right? Not just in your vendors and your program, but understand where you fit. Understand where everything fits what you're trying to do. So you can go and make the right decision. Make a scorecard. Get a clear decision. And then here's where we talk about that scorecard, right? Make your assumptions and test, right? Make your scorecard. Take the 5 questions we talked about, on how do you decide, right? And start scoring them. And run some numbers on different pieces. Okay, if I build it, here's where we stand. If I buy it with vendor A, here's where I stand. If I buy it with vendor B, here's where I stand, right? So make your assumptions, test it, make a scorecard, find some way to validate this, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go. I have a couple case studies that we'll talk about this in. As you're deciding, get some quotes from your vendors. Go talk to people, right? Go talk to as many people as you can. We're so busy, right? Vendors love to talk to you, as you well know, right? So go make some calls, understand their stuff, get some demos, push for demos, right? Don't go for the quick sales deck that that a vendor's going to try and give you. Say, hey, let's just see it. Let's talk about it as product people. Go, as I was talking with a couple peers on this presentation, go talk to other product managers. Talk to other product managers in those org. I thought, it's one of the things I do a bunch, but as we talk about, as all of us as product managers, go find the product manager at that company that's selling the service. See what they do. You will learn a ton. And then let's test drive it, right? Kick the tires, get evaluations, pull down some AWS trials, all of those things. Just keep going. So we've made our decision. We're going to either build it, we're going to buy it, right? But either way, it's a major initiative. Typically, if we're talking this kind of thing, it's a major initiative. So how do we go? So we've talked about, hey, okay, some of the questions, some of the pitfalls. How do we get it now? Right? We've made our decision. How do we go get what we want? Well, the first thing I love to do is just beg, right? So I know we're on a web conference, so the laughing is muted, right? But that's one of your first options. We can go and just beg for it. Pretty please, right? We can go and say, hey, maybe we should do this. I don't know about you, but that doesn't work a ton for me. What you really want to be doing is starting to think about business cases. These don't have to always be fancy, right? Depending on your organization, sometimes they do. When I worked at Sears, had to be fancy. I would pitch things that would go all the way up to the board level, right? Even for even just smaller investments. For big investments, absolutely. For capital things, we went in front of a capital committee. It was crazy. But we made sure to do our diligence, and we made sure, while the process was crazy, it made sure we were aligned, right? And we made sure we understood everything we needed to do. For your org or your project, you may not need to be that big. A one-pager might do it with a paragraph on each and some cost pieces, right? A little bit of ROI analysis, 5 slides. However your org does this, if your org doesn't do this in decisions, Google it. Find a quick and dirty one. Email me afterwards. I'll show you some that I've done. But go and make a business case, right? Take your checklist, pretty it up, put that in a slide. Here's what we went through. Here's what it costs. Here's what it costs in person hours, and what we think and the value we're going to get out of it, right? ROI is going to get the ROI number. That's going to be get what you want done, right? The orgs I work in, especially now, right, is we're all driven towards how is this going to help us drive revenue or business or operational costs or something, right? Put a dollar amount on this. When I work with my teams, right, that's what I say to them all the time. Make sure you put a dollar amount on this. Because if you can put it in dollar terms, talking to your executive team, talking to the decisions, talking to your boss, it's going to make them understand a lot easier. Also, so you've built your business case, you've got your ROI, understand your organizational aptitude. I've worked in a ton of orgs that are a build it here org, meaning that they will only develop features and programs if they're built in-house. Understand that. Understand what your organizational's approach on that. Because if you don't, and especially if you go with a buy case, well, you're going to get shot down every time. But if you understand this, you can also help understand what some of their triggers are for building it here, right? Oh, is in one of my roles, it's a security piece of having everything inside the firewall, security and contractual. Great, you understand that now. So now as you do your buy decisions, you understand how to work with that. Understand that organizational aptitude and really why they are there. So, it's a classic negotiation standpoint of understand the person you're negotiating with, understand their positions, and you'll have much better results. So that's, we could do a whole talk on the organizational aptitude, right? And how to negotiate that. Okay, so now let's talk about buying and how do we make it work, right? So I'm not going too much into the building piece because we know how to build. So if we decide to build it internally, right, and said, hey, let's build it internally. We know how to build roadmaps. We know how to build MVPs. We know how to work with our dev teams. We know how to write stories, right? If you don't, there's a whole library behind this that you can get that on. So that's why I'm focused on buying, because we don't always buy stuff, right? We don't always think about that. We don't always think about putting stuff in. We talk a ton about working with our dev teams, but not a ton about how to put stuff in. So that's why I put this slide in there. Not necessarily to bias on your decision, but just saying that if you're buying, you need to make sure that you have, you follow some rules and maybe get creative, right? So, as you're buying, I think there's a ton of options, right, from buying from a vendor, especially if you're buying from AWS, not a ton of options, right? It's either 10 cents a minute or 2 cents a cycle, or, they have published pricing. Not a ton, unless you're going to do billions and billions of transactions, not a ton of room to negotiate there. If you're working with a startup, there might be, right? If they're hungry for deals and hungry to show their board that they're making some traction, they may have lots of room to work with. Even established vendors have lots of different ways that they can work. So don't look at when you get a quote and say, oh my gosh, I got this quote, it's $100,000. How am I going to get that through? There's a ton of ways, right? First, negotiate that price, right? But there's a ton of different ways to work on those things. We talked about simple, nimbler vendors have more flexibility. Yep, of course. But now we get creative. So you got your $100,000 quote. You're like, what do I do with this, right? I can't afford this, right? And it's core to this thing's core, right? But I can't afford this. and it's going to take me 2 years to build it, but I need it in the next 6 months. So how do I do it? Well, let's get incremental, right? So go back to the vendor and say, hey, I don't need $100,000 now. I need $2,000 now, right? Or, you know, with one of the vendors we're working with now, we said, hey, we'll do a smaller upfront. We'll pay you on a per transaction basis, right? Hey, we do hundreds of thousands of transactions a year. Maybe we pay you on a transactional basis. Maybe that's interesting. Maybe you give them a way that they could even create some incremental revenue on their own and show that their board works. So as you think about that, so being creative, maybe help your vendors understand some of the other models, right? Especially if you get that $100,000 bill and you can say, well, over 2 years, I'm going to pay you $200,000 in transaction fees. But, you know, instead of the $100,000 here or $150,000 in transaction fees, easier for you to work in an organization, right? You know, and the vendor now has a recurring revenue source. So help them understand how maybe that would work. It's surprising. It does work. I've done it before. Some other things too, maybe delay the payment terms, maybe delay how you pay it, maybe incrementally buy it, say up at $100,000, I'm going to pay it in 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 as you ramp, right? Or say I'm going to pay you in 90 days for things. Get creative on those pieces. People want to sell. We want to make deals, right? I think that's the interesting piece about buying and negotiations in general. We as humans want to make a deal. And also think about joint go-to-market. How can you guys work together, right? That you guys can both be going to market at the same time and putting these products in market, and really helping each other, right? So, think about, hey, if you put out press releases and do press and do negotiations, do reference calls, how much is that worth to your vendor? Maybe a lot, maybe even more than your deal is, right? So think about that. And how that, those type of things, which would be expensive for your vendor to do, are kind of cheap for you to do. And then you can really help them. I'm doing this right now with a vendor right now. It's super helpful for them, and it's pretty cheap for us to do, and it's a win-win. So also, as you think about negotiations, this isn't a zero-sum game. We both want to win here. You want your vendors to win, right? Because you want them to be in business, and you want them to be good partners with you, right? So think about, as you're being creative, it's not a way just to go get the cheapest price. It's about getting the deal terms that are good for both of you. And that's one of the things that is in my career that I really push. And lastly, leave yourself some options, right? So if you're going to make a buying decision, don't be going and signing your 10-year lease. You're not buying retail space in Manhattan, right? You don't have to go sign that 10-year lease anymore. In fact, Manhattan doesn't even make you sign a 10-year lease for retail anymore. So, so you don't go and limit your options, right? Buy what you need, negotiate the terms, but don't go and sell all of your options down the road. So wrapping up, I want to, I've talked about hypotheticals, right? I've got a couple case studies here as we wrap up about how I've put this in play, right? And how I've used this thinking to evaluate some decisions. So the first one, I worked for a company that was wanting to do a personal finance application. See these out, right? Help you your spending, help you, do your budgeting. They're everywhere, right? So this company's core competency, though, was in helping end consumers understand complex things. They work in insurance, right? So they help end consumers understand your insurance options. And some of you in bigger companies may have used this stuff around. It's pretty cool stuff. So it's decision-making software, really helps you through. They wanted to think about how they would put that into personal finance. So interesting use case, right? So take this cool core tech that helps you make decisions, but put it in personal finance. Problem is they don't have any personal finance expertise at all, right? They know they want to go connect to all the banks and pull in transaction data and help with budgeting. So they know they want to go and talk to banks and do all these things, but they don't have it. The other piece too is as I just said, right? They want to get this in the market quick because the market's crowded, right? Go on the App Store, go on Google right now. You're going to find this 300 places, right? So it is in market right now, and every second someone else may be doing it better. So what did we do, right? We wanted to get to market. As I walked in the first day, and this was when I was working as a consultant for this organization. First day, they said, "Yep, let's go build it. Let's get our dev team on it. I've got a guy. Let's go build some stuff." And I was like, "Well, what stuff are we going to build?" "Well, we need to go connect to the banks, and we'll do that." And I did some quick research and said, "Well, just thinking about framing out the problems we need to solve. Just let's focus on that. We need to go connect to banks to get transaction data. We could do that, absolutely. Ton of complex regulations, right? So really hard to do. Okay, but we could do it. It's expensive. There's a whole bunch of banks, like lots, right? And everybody's got a different credit card or different banking. Okay, and interesting. There's 3 aggregators out there that sort of do this, right? And they don't quite do everything we need, but they get us 90% there. Oh, and the cool thing is I just have to give them a credit card and I can try it tomorrow. So what do you think we did, right? So we went and tried it. Went to the vendor, tried it, had a POC done tomorrow, right? Because we could go and get this piece done. It was a commodity. It was something that was off the shelf. We didn't have to go build it. The founder really wanted to build it, but he had the bias and think of the organizational aptitude. He had the bias because he'd always built it there, right? And it took actually for him, the ROI was interesting, but it took for him to see it. So going back to organizational aptitude, understand your audience, right? Once he saw how hard it was and how complex it was and how easy, to build it himself, but how easy it is to just go and pull it in, he was sold. He didn't love the idea of paying someone else and having someone else own part of his future. But, once he understood the trade-offs, it was there. And frankly, if the company goes big, giant on this piece, maybe they go build it themselves and own that market. Great. But for today, to get the MVP out, the buy was the right choice. So going back in the Wayback Machine, one of my earlier product management jobs was at a company doing document management software. We had it was just at the time that box coming up, and we were business focused, right? So we were trying to sell in the business market, solve real business problems. We had box features, right? So if I'm sure you've all used box.com. Great product, but it is first iterations, right? What could you do? You can upload and download. That's what ours did too. It did it great, and it secured it and audited it, and all the stuff Box didn't do. All the stuff you need in enterprise, right? When you have your audit controls and super security, and SaaS model locked in your firewall, right? It's just as SaaS is starting to become a thing, right? And we were actually even having those conversations about, hey, SaaS is okay for you. We had to harden it to be business quality, right? But what we were seeing though is we need some differentiation, because now we've got these competitors like Box, and it's really easy to bring that into the organization, right? We know that you can just sign up on a Box account in 3 seconds and start working, even maybe if it's not in your organizational security plan. Customers are going to do it. But we needed in a business application to be more valuable, right? Because we had to go through a procurement cycle, and we were strictly B2B. So we knew we needed to grow and evolve. And the piece that we had figured out is, how do we start solving real problems? And by solving real problems, how do we put in workflow, right? Because real problems we want to solve were around contracts, right? Around accounts payable processes, things that are documents that need to move to multiple people or do things to them, right? We need to be able to process things, not just share it, but actually process. So we went out and explored this, right? So we needed to put a workflow engine in. And the build versus buy decision was strong because we had really smart people, but time to market was critical, right? We needed to get to market critically, really fast. And with, by fast, let's say within 6 months, right? But building this, if any of you that work in a rules engine, a complex one, you know how hard it is. It's really difficult work. So we kind of figured out, doing the cost benefit, we could build it in probably about 2 years, what we thought we wanted, or we could buy something and integrate it. And that's the key thing here, integrate it in about 6 months. So that's what we did. We bought it and integrated it. The interesting thing about this, though, is I've worked with this company through the years, kind of off and on. We bought it, integrated it. It was challenging, right? Because it didn't do all the things we wanted it to. We had to sort of bend it on its head. The company we chose wasn't the best partner. Was the best technology out there, but wasn't quite the best partner. Weren't terribly responsive in fixing things or being great about making sure their tech was strong. But also kind of some things we knew. So we fought through that for several years and actually made it, probably upgraded their product better. I think, we'd done all the things, the checklist stuff, a lot of it comes from that experience, right? So we had access to their source code. We could actually make changes to their source and did in some levels. But what that allowed to do, though, I think in the denouement of this, right? So we went and built it, or went and integrated it. It was challenging for us and our customers. It wasn't exactly the experience we wanted. Didn't have all the features. We then went and built it a few years later. But what was really interesting about that piece is we'd already gone through the pain, and we knew exactly what we wanted. By then, we knew what our customers wanted. We had been demoing it and researching it for a couple of years now, and it worked sort of okay. But now we could go and build it exactly how we wanted it. We knew where the pain points were. We knew where the efficiencies needed to be. So that was really, really cool that we could go back and now start to really build exactly what we needed and what the business ultimately needed. So, a bit of a path where we did actually both the buy versus build. But, the reason I want to throw this case study in there is, and the lesson I really learned on this is you're not going to get locked in your decisions, right? So you may buy it at first and then decide to go back and build it, or vice versa, but as an org, and we talk about this all the time in product management, make sure you know what you're trying to do and be nimble, right? And evolve as you go through this. So I think that's the key piece on this. So quickly, we'll get some questions here in a second. Some final thoughts as we wrapped around. It's not always a clear answer. It's clear as mud. Make your best decision, right? Do your ROI, make your assumptions, test your assumptions, argue about your assumptions, right? That's where you should be arguing, and get some organizational clarity on that. Really, and then understand what you're trying to solve, right? Are you trying to put a workflow engine in, search engine? Understand what that is. Understand what good looks like, and if you need some help understanding that, go back to some of the other webinars that we've done, right? They're there. Know your organization. One of the things I love working on, I love negotiation strategies. I read lots of books on it. One of the a lot of classes I took through my MBA. But know your organization, right? You gotta know what especially in the build versus buy, where they're predisposed, who the key players are, right? And this will help you not just in the build versus buy, but really about getting any decision done, right? Understand your org and what their pressures are, especially your senior managers, right? Are they looking at revenue targets that they've got to hit, right? Tailor your presentation to that. Are they looking at operational efficiencies? Work towards that. Are they looking at selling the business in 3 years? Think about that, right? Know your organization. And then last thing, keep your eye on the prize, right? Know what you're trying to do. Be hyper focused on it. Decide as an org, decide as a team what it is you're trying to accomplish, and just be sick focused on that, right? And keep driving, you know, all the way through. So Jordan, with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Scott. That was fantastic. Really appreciate your time and awesome content. I think it's something that a lot of product people land up having to think about on many of their major projects. At the moment, it does not look like we have any questions, which is surprising.
Nobody has to do this.
Yeah, no, I'm very surprised. But is there anybody who wants to ask a question? If so, quickly, you know, post it into the YouTube Q&A, and I'll get your question in. Let's give that just a couple of seconds, see if anything comes of it. In the meantime, I will then just take this opportunity once again. Thank you, Scott, for your discussion on build versus buy, evaluating technology decisions. As well, this presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. And again, a big thank you from me to Scott. Excellent conversation. And it looks like there are no questions. I guess you were just that clear that, you know, there are no questions. Yeah, everyone is just ready to tackle this problem.
Excellent. A little snowy. I guess it's a little snowy. Everybody's little brains are a little cold this morning.
Perhaps. Alrighty, thanks, Scott. You have
thanks, Jordan.
Good one. Okay, so switching over to our next presenter, starting that off. It's Sunday, February 10th, 2019, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we are joined by one of our mentors, Andrew Shu, to lead a talk on product manage your way into a product management job. So I'll now turn it over to Andrew to take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for your time today. So as mentioned, I'll be speaking today on how to use product management to get yourself a product management gig. So to kind of get to practice the craft while also getting yourself a job. A bit about me to start. In my past, I was an electrical engineer, and I have about 7+ years of product management. In my past, I've helped launch Android and iOS apps to consumers, helped around 700,000 people, coordinated a design refresh of Google's sign-in experience, helped grow startups that use machine learning to value homes, as well as consulted large organizations to help raise company motivation and performance. At present, I'm at Oscar Health, helping manage our doctor information to help members find care most effectively. So why this is important, or why I'm speaking about this today. So fortunately, I have experience over the past 7+ years, kind of working for many different companies, conducting 2 from scratch job searches, as well as working within 3 different cities. Furthermore, it seems like finding a job has just been kind of a consistent point of conversation as I've mentored within the Product Mentor program these last 2 years. So it just felt like really relevant, as well as I just came through a from scratch job search this July. Okay, so today, this is what I'll be going through. So kind of a product management process and frameworks to kind of keep you moving and rolling through and figuring out basically how to get product market fit. So the product is yourself, and the market is the job industry that you're looking for in a specific role. But you know, processes and frameworks, they're not very clear to start, or they're not clear how you might apply them. So I'm hoping to then tell stories that can provide inspiration and help you kind of customize ideas that you might have. Close to the end, we'll do some lessons on kind of favorite lessons learned. And then I have an ask for you actually at the end of this if you are job searching. Okay, so to jump into the product management processes and frameworks, I don't know how new this will be for many people, but I think you know, the first thing is always just to start solving the problem. So a lot of people, you know, you have an idea about a problem that might exist, but many times you just have an idea of a solution. More important than kind of doing research on your solution is actually going and solving that problem. I find that comes up a lot. So in the case of looking for a job, you really need to start interviewing, speaking with people, seeing if you can find that job. But always the number one thing is going and actually trying to solve that problem. And what that will do then is it'll give you time to retro. Oh, sorry about that. This is the outline. Sorry about that. So it's problem solving, a problem solving process, and then a roadmap for you to articulate and write down your plan, and then a framework for you to write down your adjustments. I actually had jumped into the problem solving piece, my mistake. Okay, so jumping into the actual problem solving. So like I said, it's very important just to start in that problem solving process. So going out and starting the interview. And then what naturally leads after that is actually to retro how you did, decide on adjustments you need to make. And then a very important thing within product management is also then sharing your results. It's important to share your results internally with your team so they know what's happening. It's important to share it externally with your clients and with other departments. It's also important to actually market to yourself and kind of keep yourself motivated about where you're going. And so this is kind of the typical product management process that I use for any sort of problem. As part of the problem solving process, on a weekly and definitely monthly basis, typically weekly, I do the following kind of two framework maps to keep track of everything that is going on. And so it's really the definition of where we'd like to go and how we're going to get there. So first framework that I regularly track is vision, mission, and monthly roadmap. Vision is kind of your 5 to 10 year goal in the realm of job searching. Maybe it's where you want to be in 5 to 10 years. The mission would be the statement that you have to others about what job you're looking for now, what role, what industry, why it's important to you. And then your monthly roadmap is just, you know, where have you come from, and what is your goal next month, and what do you hope to accomplish? The second part of the framework that I like to regularly track is consistently taking down what are the lessons that you've learned for retros, what are the accomplishments that you've made. This is extremely important, both personally and for teams. I think as product managers, we many times are always focused on what do we need to solve next? How do we drive more value? And we forget how far we've come. And so it's very important to keep track of your accomplishments. And then finally, I find that in regularly reviewing your retro and your accomplishments, you naturally start to come up with new goals for the week and figure out how you may update your roadmap. So we just went through kind of the product management problem solving process in two kind of segments to continuously document, to kind of keep you problem solving, and then being able to orient yourself and move ahead. But as I said, that's cute. I mean, that's really just a framework and processes that I think a lot of people have heard of before. So let's see how that actually plays out in the real world, which tends to be extremely messy. Okay, so the story to kind of break down using that process and those product management tools. So this past actually July, I was laid off in job searching. The startup I'd been at had been successful, but we actually changed and started targeting a different set of clients to kind of de-risk our past situation. So unfortunately, we didn't acquire customers as soon as we needed to, so I was laid off. So month one, what was my quote unquote roadmap? Well, I actually just wanted to transition smoothly and try to relax. This is the second purely from scratch job search that I've been in. And I know previously what actually happened to me was I took design courses. I started taking engineering classes. I founded a company and I tried to buy a home the last time I was unemployed. So the lesson for me, the retro from the last unemployment, was just try and relax a bit. But in reality, that rarely happens. So definitely not relaxing. Multiple trips to T-Mobile just to get onto a new phone. 2 extra weeks of work just helping transition off the old startup, which I still have a great relationship with today. Being at home a lot, started to organize the entire home and started receiving unsolicited introductory emails and meetings. So in reality, you know, I'm just forced to write a mission statement to start talking about the type of role and job and industry that I was looking for, and forced to prepare for meetings to try and find new jobs. So just to kind of dive into the meeting prep process, I think this actually, you know, links over to user experience research as well, or, you know, your market. But before I take any meeting, I do a lot of deep research on a person's background. So for example, I go to LinkedIn, looking for connections, looking for that person's stability or tenure at the job they are at, looking at Greenhouse for the company they're working at to kind of get a sense of the culture of the company, looking at Crunchbase because the round of funding kind of tells you what stage of growth a company might be in, as well as what their next goals might be. Looking at their blogs, what have they recently been focusing on? What are they an expert at? What can I ask this person that I'm meeting about? And in publications, you know, what is that company's marketing focus on? What are their major initiatives? And so the goal of that, all that research and prep, is just so that, you know, you can ask thoughtful questions. You have a hypothesis on what they're working on, what their problems are, and how you can help. So after this meeting prep, the meetings, typically the flow that I would see is you come up, you do pleasantries, you know, I tell my story, they tell their story, and we kind of offer each other topical help and just talk generally about different positions and problems that their companies experience. We drink a ton of coffee. But at the end of it, what was typically the most ideal outcome was actually just asking for help and introductions, offering help definitely where I could. And I didn't find myself too much ever explicitly asking for a job, but this is the typical meeting flow. And so this to me is the actual problem solving piece of that product management process that we're talking about. You're there, you're working through to understand their situation. You are the product. Can you fit? Can you add value? So as always, after you kind of are problem solving, you want to retro. So first off, I was extremely caffeinated, way too many meetings. Definitely want to start switching to tea. I found that my past stories were not specific enough. So to just talk about the companies that I'd worked at or talking about what I'd launched wasn't specific enough. I needed to review my past, turn it into a clear story, and actually articulate, you know, hey, this is what I launched. This is what I managed. These are the problems that I overcame. And just getting more and more specific versus being kind of a higher level. And my mission was unclear. Because I didn't know the market yet. I would argue that I wasn't clear enough asking for the specific role or type of company I was looking for. And I wasn't actually sure about what to do about that. So you can see it's kind of messy, but we're retroing, I'm learning. So it was a good experience. And so now to go, okay, so we've walked through the actual, you know, product process. So problem solved, retro, thinking about adjustments I can make, but then the documentation, this is where it starts to come in. So previously you can see, so if we imagine at the beginning of this month, I didn't have a mission, I didn't have a vision. My whole roadmap was just to relax. But I was forced to write a mission. And this is what I mean by mission not being super clear. This is actually an email I wrote to somebody. You can see, at least to me, this feels long. It's kind of opaque. It's not as clear as I'd like it to be. So it's definitely something I knew that I wanted to refine. But I documented this because this is how I'd be able to refine and look at where I'd come from and try and make this more and more specific. So I documented a roadmap, documented a mission, and then went through the documentation of retro and accomplishments. So this is a quick, you know, just collating. So drink tea, practice speaking about my past accomplishments, keep searching and practicing my mission, the accomplishments where I met a lot of interesting people, landed an interview, and then goals, thinking about what I can do next is, oh, let me make sure I start applying in earnest, really kind of open all the kind of top of funnel channels that I can to meet people, meet companies, and get more comfortable with my story. And so when writing this and looking at kind of what had happened in the last month, it naturally led to updating the roadmap. So I knew I wanted to make a new mission kind of going forward. In September, the next month, I really want to start applying and interviewing in earnest. And the goal was that I set for myself was to get 3 interviews. So you can see how we problem solved, we retroed, and then we were documenting so that we can kind of see and share where we are. So month 2, applying and interviewing. So going along the lines of just starting to problem solve, turned on LinkedIn, emailed friends directly asking for job leads. I'm always surprised by how bashful people are to reach out to people. Trying to mention in the flow of conversations with people I've met that, you know, I was laid off, and explain kind of what excited me and what I'm looking for. And then in reality, trying to take every meeting, just get those reps in to really practice and refine you as a product. So, you know, speaking with friends, speaking with recruiters, taking as many interviews as I could. So let's jump into the kind of first interview that I took. So this is actually a public company. They'd been around for 20 years. They had 2,000 people, bi-coastal, and they're actually going through a big reorg. They had acquired a startup that would take them from being more of a manual operation to more automated. And so I met them through this startup that they'd acquired that they trusted to automate much of their business practices. So what that interview looked like was meeting with two general managers in New York who gave me business context, told me about key problems that the company was facing, and then actually had situational asks. So they said, hey, given, you know, the business context and the problems that we're facing, what would you do? And that conversation went really smoothly. And so they transitioned me to meeting with a project manager who I'd be working closely with on the projects to solve the problems that I'd spoke with the GMs in New York about. So this was mainly actually a process conversation, looking at how we'd work together. That went smoothly. And so after that, they introduced me to the folks in Seattle, because I'd be kind of coordinating projects between both offices. So both the new manager and a head of business. And again, talking about company structure, the new responsibilities, kind of the goals for the next 6 months. Again, smoothly. Then I met a co-founder. So this is actually the co-founder of the AI startup that had been acquired. Just talked about what he's looking for. So over the course of 6 weeks, spoke with 5 leaders across 3 offices. And I thought it was going well. But the result was actually completely getting ghosted after about 6 weeks. So complete radio silence. So that can lead to a lot of doubts about, you know, hey, as a product for myself, what's going on here? And I think that definitely applies as well to products that you're building. As you're searching for product market fit, you're kind of stumbling around in the dark. So problem solved. All right, time to retro. So besides being surprised, some fun added context to this is actually the co-founder of the startup that was acquired by this company that was managing the reorg was actually a friend's stepfather's company. I reached out to him once, still nothing, and I stopped. I mean, I'm sure we'll see each other again soon, but retroing it, it's just the realization really that, you know, no one owes you really anything. Volatility is kind of constant within companies. And speaking to another friend, he reminded me, you know, at least half the time as well, when a company rejects you, it's not you. Budgets change, needs change. Company could be reorganizing. In the case of startups, many times it could even be on the brink of shutting down. So the adjustments that I wanted to make based on this retro was just getting used to no feedback, as well as practicing evaluating a company's stability, because I think that's kind of a key factor many times in a smooth interview and hiring process as well. So that was one of the first main interviews that I did that month. And that leads naturally into kind of another interview that I thought was pretty interesting. So for this second interview, there's a 100-person startup here in New York. They were at their Series B, so they were in a growth stage. And how the interview went was like this. So I first met with the COO. It was quite casual, just getting to know. Most interesting to me is why a COO was conducting interviews at the first stage, because normally it's a recruiter. And he said that it was really that important for them to be finding talent. So I thought that was a great answer. And after that, I met with the CTO and managing director. And the question that stands out the CTO asked was really around, you know, what is the role of product management? What's the ideal kind of partnership? And we kind of discussed how product management is kind of a translator and understanding many facets of the business, framing problems so people can solve them as effectively as possible. And then went through different conceptual questions, such as, you know, what is your favorite application? How would you scale that out? How would you increase its impact given unlimited resources? Again, that went well. So then I met with the CEO. He talked through different kind of how they problem solved, how they innovated on the problems that they were facing. Actually went through, as well how the company had shifted its culture. It had previously been a sales-led organization with product and engineering left to build product after the sales cycle had been closed, and how they'd shifted that actually by having to let go of quite a few of the sales leaders to shift towards a product organization. So again, very, very profound conversations, and I was very impressed that they'd actually shifted their culture. I actually then scheduled another meeting with the managing director to talk through the role shifts and expectations and make sure that we were on the same page. And then finally, fifth interview, come into a 30-minute meeting, and out of nowhere, at least seeming to me, I get a consulting question, which is, how many ways could you organize these paintings into folders for an imaginary customer? And so I really nailed down who the customer was, just thought about how, just divining the customer and thinking through the exact solution for that customer. And the result was another complete radio silence. So another 6 weeks of kind of meeting everybody within the organization, talks going very well, seemingly so. And then just, again, absolutely no feedback. So this retro actually took a lot longer than the kind of a standard retro. So I'd gone, done the interview, now it's time to learn. But honestly, this one took a while. So first it was just getting over what a ridiculous kind of, at least to me, someone comes in 5 minutes late to a 5th round interview. And then a question, at least to me, completely unrelated to my job, and not even a word of response or feedback or anything. So 2 weeks pass, and I realized, hey, I really need to start diving into this retro, regardless of how much it hurts or what my beliefs are. So looking into it, I realized that there are a couple flaws that I had. So first was, I was definitely having false expectations. I felt like I should solve problems here like I solved them in the real world. I've got experience with product. Well, that's false. This is not the real world. This is an interview. Furthermore, I didn't feel like I was accurately solving the real questions being asked, which was, they're not only asking you the questions of, hey, this, how would you solve this problem? Or these conceptual, but they're looking for culture fit. They're looking for expansive thinking. They're looking for your creativity, looking for your grit. They're looking for a lot of other factors, and need to make sure that I address that. Two other shortcomings where I wasn't managing my time effectively. It's a very compressed time frame. People are naturally coming from other meetings. People are often going to be late and they're switching context. You've got to manage the time and not being positive enough. Thinking through that, so now that you've made the retro, as always, what adjustments are you going to make after you've kind of looked at the situation and how things went? Well, the adjustment I made was I was actually going to practice against those failings that we just talked about. So I asked friends who interviewed at their companies to ask me all kinds of different interview questions. And I practiced answering them in a 30-minute time frame. Practice the positivity, practice time management, practice like moving it forward, solving different types of problem. And I did this about 5 or 6 times with many different people. And some major adjustments I found, besides being positive and being able to push something forward, was anytime I'm stuck, I think something very positive is to work backwards. So for example, like if this feature is going to be successful, what has to be true? Well, it has to reach your customers. It needs to be engaging. It needs to, have a conversion rate of 50%. It needs to make this much money, etc. What's nice there is as you break apart what's required to be successful, then you can actually ask your interviewer, hey, so these are the major modules, major pieces that would be required to solve the problem that you've posed to me. Which one would you like me to focus on? I found this very, very helpful, as well as speaking with different kind of Google and Facebook PMs. After answering a conceptual question, I remember one PM said that he likes to think 3D after he poses a solution. So he thinks vertically, up and down, like how can I have a more expansive problem? How could I be even more impactful? How could I get more specific? How could I solve this problem for this person directly in the context of their life? Or horizontally, what other companies could I integrate? Who could I partner with? But it gives you the ability to then not even just land on your solution, but to think expansively about how you could be more effective or scale it in different ways. So that was actually the adjustments that I made after the retro. And And so that was kind of the end of the month. So jumping back into, okay, so we did the process. So we solved the problem, we retroed, made adjustments, and then I found that this documentation as well as it sets us up for the sharing. So let's jump into the documentation at the end of the month. So the retros, don't expect feedback. I need to lose my expectations, be positive, manage my time, answer the true questions being asked. Accomplishments, regardless, I did make it to 2 final round interviews at companies I was very much excited about and respected. And I felt more and more comfortable talking about my past accomplishments. The goals for the next month, as a friend told me, there's an opportunity to make a world-class network while you're interviewing. And not many people have that time when you have a full-time job. So enjoy it, kind of relish it. So my goals were to meet more people, get to know the New York scene more, and find communities I wanted to be a part of long-term. So after kind of documenting this, it naturally leads to now, as we see, updating the roadmap. So vision, still unknown. I took a bunch of life quizzes, didn't provide much clarity. My mission really started to refine. So I started landing on, I'm really looking for a company with more than 100 people. I knew that I'd worked in startups quite a bit in the past. So I was trying to look at more mid-size in healthcare, emergency services, or energy. And in October, so after the goal was to actually invest in networks so I could expand the top of my funnel, so I could meet more people and have a broader base of people to speak with. Okay, so jumping into month 3, investing in networks. So first thing, just to think about how I was going to set this up and meet more people. So a great way to kind of meet different networks is university alumni groups, ex-company groups, and meetup groups. Shout out to Product Mentor, just like this. And so, yeah, I actually set up meetings with, or I started attending events at all these different networking events. I attended about four events that this month. Met or found 2 amazing companies. Met a lot of inspiring people. Got a lot of introductions. Didn't get any interviews out of it, being frank. So had good conversations. Was inspired. Felt like I got to know the market more. But there wasn't nothing actually direct fruit coming out of that. So retroing it, I found that it was best if I went with one other person. It would just kind of keep conversations moving a bit smoother. They bring good energy, different types of questions along with me when we go. An easy way to kind of take the angst out of feeling like it's quote unquote networking was just choosing long-term communities that I wanted to be a part of. So just being consistent then at that point, you want to be there, their community you want to be a part of. So just be consistent. I knew my mission was landing better, and then I knew that I wanted to continue being part of these communities even if after getting a job. Okay, so in parallel, not due to networking, but just due to work in the past, I also had kind of a third interview. So with this company, it was 200 people, a 200-person startup, Series D, and went something like this. So it started off with a recruiter interview, just giving me a company background. And then I did a call with the GM discussing the product role and their needs and why this was the right time for them to hire the next kind of product manager. After that, I did an in-person, again, with the GM and the head of operations. And in this one, they asked me to do a case study where I redesigned an existing big feature of theirs. And then I headed into the all-day interview, which we'll get into in more detail. Okay, so besides getting into the all-day interview, which I knew was going to be kind of about 3 to 4 groups and a presentation, I conducted a pre-mortem. And this is actually something that I use in product all the time with new big features that we're going to launch. And so it's looking at the reasons that if this feature launched, what are the main reasons that this feature could fail? And how do we actively mitigate against that failure? So thinking about the past retros that we went through, so imagine, job 2, the different lessons that we had, I listed the main reasons that I would fail at this all-day interview. So number 1 is not actively managing my time. And I figured I would mitigate that by always maintaining a sense of urgency, recognizing and knowing that I'm fighting the clock, and just constantly actively managing it. Second, is not being positive. So regardless of what happens in my expectations, I need to stay stay calm and positive. And then finally, looking at it is just the fact that what if I get off topic and don't answer the exact question that they're asking? And my mitigation was actually going to be, I will notice when the conversation's not flowing as much or people seem slightly confused. I'd actually rebase, and I thought about it and said, well, the only way I can find out what to do is ask them. So I said, you know what, I'm going to pull up and ask them directly if the solution is going in the direction they're expecting. And if it's not, I'm going to ask them directly, what are they looking for and expecting? So the interview, so we jumped in, so they set up the problem. So with the head of operations and two of his team. So we kind of defined a scaling issue that they were having with ingesting information. Then I met with the CTO and two engineers. And this one, just to research the technical stack behind the problem. And I didn't feel that this was actually going very smooth. So thinking about the pre-mortem, I rebased. I said, hey, you know, what do you think I should focus on, to the CTO? And he said, look, just really focus on the problem. You don't need to worry about the customer situation or the tech stack. You know, you should take this problem at face value. And so that was very helpful. After that, I had kind of a stressful lunch because I'm sitting there thinking, okay, the problem the solution I've been framing for the last hour and a half, 2 hours, isn't as accurate as I want it to be. So it was kind of a stressful lunch. And then we jumped into the next 2 hours of problem solving. So what I did was during lunch, I was thinking about, okay, what is the more accurate solution? How do I kind of get this to where I need it to go? So again, pulling that same mitigation strategy, I rebased with the GM. I said, hey, here's the problem that I've heard and the solution that I'm now moving towards. Does this feel accurate? And this is how I feel like I'm going to present it. What's the ideal presentation format for you? And extremely helpful. He said, hey, you know, I think this is the right direction. And given the audience, the most accurate kind of presentation I'd love to see is a 30, 60, 90-day plan. And so I was like, perfect. I now had a structure of how I wanted to present the solution. So what I did then is I spent 30 minutes building upon that 30, 60, 90-day plan. I reviewed it with an engineer, got feedback, built it with them together, spent another 30 minutes solo, again, building, and then actually came back to the GM and got feedback again, and then gave that presentation to 8 people about a 3-month roadmap to solve the issue they were facing. So the result was actually, it was actually really positive. People were really happy about the presentation. And in fact, they conducted an immediate retro with the entire kind of leadership team right after my presentation, gave great feedback, it was positive, and then gave me a whole hour more to ask questions. So it was a really positive interview and I was really excited. And the result is they actually hired someone more experienced. So that's a huge downer. But it kind of goes back to the lessons that we've kind of been building upon, as you can see. So, so retroing it, the past retro 100% helped. The mitigation strategies worked. I'm learning, I'm evolving myself as a product. And it reinforced the past lesson that your performance is at most half of the equation in interviews. So then thinking through the adjustments that I might make off that, the main items for me were try to get to a solution even faster and add more perspectives. And the perspectives I wanted to add in the solution were actually start presenting design and more technical solutions sooner. Okay, so again, we're kind of near the end of the month, or actually I usually do this on a weekly basis, but time to document, kind of think through and look at what you've accomplished in the retros. So the retro from the last month is just, you know, okay, great, things are going smoother. Time to practice presenting design solutions and technical. How do I evolve that? Accomplishments, I did have 3 interviews and I made a lot of progress getting more comfortable in these interviews and mitigating against kind of weaknesses in the past. And the goals coming up for the next month were, you know, excited to meet even more people, keep expanding the top of my funnel. And I started getting interested as well into how VCs evaluate markets and choose their investments, because I felt that this would help me also select companies in a more effective way. And then the adjustment, as you can imagine from the retro, was practice getting to design technical solutions more quickly within an interview. Okay, as well, so filling out the adjustment piece, filling out goals. Now I started filling out the roadmap. So imagine if I was on a team, I could actually share with the team, you know, where we'd come from and where we're trying to go. Vision, I was still not clear on. I don't know what I want to do specifically long-term with my life. Mission, a lot more conviction. Definitely looking for a company that's 100 people plus, working in medical wellness, emergency response, or energy. and knowing that I'd like to close a job by next April to kind of add more and more constraints, which is always helpful as a product manager when you're trying to prioritize. And from a roadmap standpoint, for the next month, the goal would be to study the New York market, learn how VCs evaluate industries, find more industries I'm interested in, and then hit pause in December. Okay, so going to month 4, which I themed as, studying the New York market. So I was doing the interview. So this was a 1,200 person Series D company. So it went something like, so I had a call with a recruiter. They came in a little late, gave me background. And then I did another recruiter call, and then finally did a product situational call where we discussed a problem that this team had faced in the past and how I might solve it, which went really smoothly. And then an all-day kind of on-site with 4 product managers, where we went through kind of 6 different case studies about different situations that had happened within the company, conceptual questions, as well as kind of talking through the culture, what they were looking for, what opportunities existed, as well as a engineering problem where 2 engineers kind of came in with a architecture drawing of their exact stack and discussed a problem they were working on. And we kind of worked through it and treated it just like if we actually partnered and solved it. And so the result of this was, this is actually the interview process for Oscar Health, and ended up in me actually getting a job. So again, so this was the actual problem solving. So I'm the product, I'm there. So even given success, you always need to retro. So 2 mistakes that I saw were, one is I didn't know all the roles open at Oscar at the time. Someone specifically asked if there are other roles other than the one we were discussing that I was interested in. So next time I wanted to adjust and definitely study all open roles at a company. And I could have reached out to friends earlier to learn more about Oscar. So those are kind of the 2 adjustments that I landed on that I wanted to make. Okay, so to recap, so how to use product management to kind of get yourself a product management gig. Well, here's a process that I regularly use to solve problems as a product manager. So start solving the problem. Don't make assumptions about what that solution would be. As soon as you're out there, you're going to have great feedback points to start retroing what you can adjust, make those adjustments, and then do the documentation in the following pages so that you can share with yourself, with your team, internal to your company, where you are, where you're trying to go, and what kind of your latest lessons are. Regularly document your roadmap. So what's your vision? That's going to be much more in line with your company. Document your mission, where you're trying to go in a year, and document what you're doing on a monthly basis, as well as regularly make your adjustments. Collate your retros, collate your accomplishments, be able to talk about them on a moment's notice, and refine your goals using this documentation. So outside of that, jump into just some other favorite bonus lessons. So one is when I found industry maps, I found this so helpful when looking for a job, because so CBI Insights has a lot of great industry maps. So it can really help you kind of pick an area of focus or to spread your focus out across multiple areas. So you get a wide exposure to the amount of companies and the problems that they're solving within an industry. But I found this kind of a very motivating way to look for jobs and look for introductions. And then the other major thing that just really stuck is it's all about the people. Don't stare at the computer screen. It's really not going to give you feedback, and it rarely gets you interviews. Just make sure you keep a steady stream of conversations, meetings, and interviews going. That's really what's going to give you your feedback and get you your practice in. And also, there's a lot of what ifs when you interview. You're kind of bumping your head around in the dark, just like when you're trying to find product market fit. So 2 guiding posts that I think are always helpful is just think long term. If a company or person that you're meeting, you know that you want to have a long-term relationship with, they're a good bet to keep the conversation going. And follow the energy. You'll notice what's inspiring to you and energizing. So stick with that. Finally, if you are job searching, I have an ask for you at the end of this, which is to take the first step. So, write an email, call a friend, walk over to your roommate right now and just say, hey, long time, whatever your pleasantries are, and say, in your past, what did you do? What did you own? What have you accomplished? And hey, I'm looking for what you're looking for, what product management role, in what industry, and why are you interested? and ask if they have time to grab coffee or talk next week and kick off that conversation so you can get started immediately. And with that, thank you for everyone's time today.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Fantastic. Does not look like we have any questions in the queue. Again, surprising, but it does happen. All righty. So again, thank you, Andrew, for your discussion on product manager way into a product management gig. This presentation as well will be posted to our SlideShare channel. And again, a big thank you to Andrew from me for his time and wisdom on job searching, in particular with product management. Thanks, Andrew.
You're welcome.
All right, so I guess we are wrapping up today's session. Thank you to everyone who joined us today and all the members of the Product Mentor program. And don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor, like today's speaker as Andrew, Scott, and Chris, please go to theproductmentor.com and sign up today. We are always looking for talented mentors to take on the challenge of making better product people in the future. Also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own job board, theproductjobs.com. And okay, that concludes our session for today. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everyone. Thank you for attending.